The Tau homeworld, simply known as Tau, exists in the eastern fringe of the galaxy, far removed from the cradle of humanity and the ancient conflicts that shaped the Imperium. This distance from Terra meant that the Tau species developed along an entirely different evolutionary and cultural trajectory, unburdened by the psychic awakening that plagued humanity during Old Night. The planet itself presented a world of varied environments and ecological niches, each demanding different adaptations from its inhabitants. In the earliest recorded periods of Tau history, the species existed as primitive hunter-gatherers scattered across the plains of their homeworld. These early Tau lived in small tribal groups, their technology barely extending beyond worked stone and bone. The Plains tribes represented the most numerous of these early communities, dwelling in the vast grasslands that covered significant portions of the primary continent. These plains dwellers developed as nomadic hunters, following the migrations of the large herbivores that grazed across the endless steppes. Their settlements were temporary affairs, constructed from animal hides and flexible wooden frames that could be dismantled and transported as the tribe moved with the seasons. The physical characteristics of these proto-Tau already showed the traits that would define the species in later millennia. They possessed blue-gray skin tones, hooved feet adapted for running across open ground, and four-fingered hands with opposable thumbs capable of sophisticated tool manipulation. Their flat, noseless faces featured a lateral slit for breathing and large eyes positioned for excellent forward vision. Unlike humans, the Tau possessed no significant psychic presence in the warp, a trait that would prove both limiting and protective in equal measure as their civilization developed. Beyond the plains, other Tau populations adapted to radically different environments. In the mountainous regions that thrust upward along the continental spine, tribes established themselves in natural cave systems and rocky outcroppings. These mountain dwellers became adept at navigating treacherous terrain, developing techniques for climbing and defending easily fortified positions. The altitude and isolation of their settlements meant these groups had minimal contact with the plains tribes, and over generations, subtle differences in dialect and custom emerged. The mountains provided different resources than the plains, mineral deposits, hardy mountain fauna, and plants adapted to thin air and rocky soil. The forest regions presented yet another distinct ecological zone. Dense woodlands covered the wetter areas of the continent, where greater rainfall supported thick canopies and diverse undergrowth. The Tau who inhabited these forests became skilled trackers and ambush hunters, learning to move silently through the vegetation and read the subtle signs of animal passage. They constructed their dwellings in clearings or among the massive root systems of the largest trees, developing techniques for working wood into increasingly sophisticated structures. The forest tribes learned which plants were edible, which held medicinal properties, and which were deadly poison, knowledge that would later prove valuable when these groups eventually unified. Near the coasts and along major river systems, communities developed around access to water. These groups became the first Tau to develop permanent settlements, as the reliable food sources from fishing and the fertility of river valleys allowed them to establish fixed villages. They crafted boats from hollowed logs and woven reeds, venturing onto the water to exploit resources unavailable to their landlocked cousins. The water-dwelling tribes also developed the earliest forms of agriculture among the Tau, cultivating edible plants in the rich soil of floodplains and learning to predict seasonal flooding patterns. For thousands of years, these separated groups existed in relative isolation from one another. Contact between different ecological zones remained minimal, limited to occasional encounters at the boundaries where one environment transitioned into another. Trade was virtually non-existent, as each group possessed only the most basic tools and resources. The concept of territory remained fluid, defined more by practical considerations of hunting grounds and resource access than by any abstract notion of borders or ownership. This fragile equilibrium shattered during the period that would later be known as the Montau, which translates roughly as the Age of Terror or Time of Death in the Tau language. As populations grew and hunting grounds became increasingly contested, conflicts erupted between neighboring tribes. What began as isolated skirmishes over access to water sources or particularly productive hunting territories escalated into sustained warfare. The Tau, despite their relatively peaceful later reputation, proved themselves entirely capable of organized violence when survival demanded it. The Mon Tau saw the development of the first true weapons designed specifically for killing other Tau rather than hunting animals. Stone-tipped spears became longer and sturdier, designed to punch through the natural resilience of Tau hide. Clubs evolved into more sophisticated war implements, often studded with sharp stones or animal teeth to maximize damage. Tribes began constructing defensive fortifications, particularly the mountain dwellers who enhanced natural cave systems with walls of piled stone and narrow choke points that could be defended by small numbers against larger forces. The Plains tribes, with their mobility and larger populations, often found themselves at war with multiple neighbors simultaneously. Their nomadic lifestyle, once an advantage for following game herds, became a liability when hostile tribes could attack their vulnerable traveling columns. Some Plains groups abandoned their traditional migrations entirely, establishing fortified settlements that could be defended year-round. This shift represented a fundamental change in Plains culture, as the accumulated knowledge of seasonal patterns and migration routes, passed down through countless generations, began to fade. The warfare intensified as tribes developed increasingly sophisticated tactics. Ambushes became common, with forest tribes proving particularly adept at using terrain to their advantage. Mountain fortresses turned into nearly impregnable strongholds, their defenders rolling rocks down steep slopes onto attacking forces or using narrow passes to negate numerical superiority. Coastal tribes used their boats to launch raids along river systems, striking deep into the territory of groups that had never developed water-based defenses. The conflict consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. Hunting grounds were abandoned as they became battlefields. Tribes that had sustained themselves for generations found their populations decimated by constant warfare. The knowledge keepers, the eldest members of each tribe who maintained oral histories and practical wisdom, were killed in raids, taking irreplaceable information with them to their deaths. Some tribes were wiped out entirely, their genetic lines terminated, and their cultural practices lost forever. The Tau species stood on the precipice of self-destruction. Estimates suggest that the population of the homeworld may have declined by as much as half during the worst periods of the Mon Tau. The survivors grew increasingly desperate, and the warfare took on a savage character as tribes fought not for territory or resources, but for simple survival. Prisoners were rarely taken, and the concept of mercy became an unaffordable luxury. The plains ran red with Tau blood, the forests echoed with the screams of the dying, and the mountains witnessed the extinction of entire communities. Then, without warning or precedent, the Ethereals appeared. The exact circumstances of their emergence remain shrouded in mystery, even within Tau historical records. They manifested simultaneously across the homeworld, appearing to the warring tribes as if they had always existed yet had only now chosen to reveal themselves. These Ethereals possessed physical characteristics that marked them as distinctly Tau, the same blue-gray skin, hooved feet, and four-fingered hands, yet they bore subtle differences that set them apart. A diamond-shaped organ sat prominently on their foreheads, and they carried themselves with an innate authority that transcended their lack of weapons or warriors. The Ethereals spoke of the Tava, the greater good, a philosophy that proposed a radical reorganization of Tau society. Rather than competing tribes destroying one another over limited resources, the Ethereals taught that each group possessed unique strengths that could benefit all Tau if properly coordinated. The plains dwellers' mobility, the mountain tribes' defensive expertise, the forest hunters' stealth, and the water dwellers' agricultural knowledge, all these could be combined into a civilization far greater than the sum of its parts. The response to the Ethereals was immediate and unprecedented. Tribes that had been locked in generations-long blood feuds ceased hostilities within days of an Ethereal's arrival. Warriors who had spent their entire lives training to kill other Tau laid down their weapons and listened to the philosophy of the greater good. The mountain fortresses opened their gates, the plains tribes ceased their raids, and the forest hunters emerged from the shadows to join their former enemies in councils of peace. The speed and totality of this transformation defied logical explanation. No military force compelled the tribes to submit. The Ethereals commanded no armies and made no threats. They simply spoke, and the Tau listened, convinced utterly of the rightness of the path being offered. Within a single generation, the Montau ended, and the unified Tau civilization began its first tentative steps toward the stars. The most detailed account of the ethereal arrival comes from the legend of Phaeton, a settlement that would become central to Tau historical identity. The city, if such a term can be applied to what was essentially a fortified collection of structures, sat on the boundary between the plains and the foothills of the mountain ranges. Its position made it strategically valuable, but also vulnerable, caught between two populations that had been locked in conflict for generations. The plains tribes viewed the settlement as an obstacle to their traditional migration routes and a source of raids into their hunting grounds. The mountain dwellers saw it as a forward position from which to project power onto the lowlands and control access to the mineral-rich highlands. The siege of Phaeton had dragged on for what the fragmentary records suggest was nearly 5 years. The settlement's defenders, primarily composed of what would later be recognized as proto-Pheo caste members, builders and craftsmen who had developed sophisticated fortification techniques, had managed to hold against repeated assaults from the plains tribes. Their walls, constructed from fitted stone reinforced with timber frameworks, represented some of the most advanced architecture the Tau had yet achieved. The defenders had access to springs within the settlement boundaries, solving the water problem that doomed most sieges, and they had stockpiled sufficient food to outlast their besiegers. The plains warriors, however, showed no signs of abandoning their assault. They had constructed their own semi-permanent camps surrounding Phaeton, effectively settling into a war of attrition. Their strategy involved preventing any supplies from reaching the defenders, while launching periodic attacks to probe for weaknesses in the fortifications. The mountain tribes, recognizing that the fall of Phaeton would leave their own territories exposed to plains raiders, had committed warriors to reinforce the defenders, creating a complex military situation where two distinct populations defended the same position while maintaining their mutual hostility. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated despite the adequate supplies. The defenders and their mountain allies existed in a state of constant tension, unable to coordinate effectively due to their cultural differences and generations of inherited animosity. Disputes over strategy, resource allocation, and command authority threatened to tear apart the defense from within. The plains besiegers faced similar problems, as different tribal groups competed for glory and disagreed on tactics. The siege had become a microcosm of the Montau itself, senseless, destructive, and apparently without resolution. Into this deadlock walked two Ethereals. The records identify them as Onwe and Onva, though whether these were their actual names or titles assigned by later historians remains unclear. Onwe approached the plains besiegers while Onva entered Phaeton itself. Neither carried weapons or war armor. They simply walked through the battle lines, and the fighting stopped. Warriors who had been preparing to launch an assault instead found themselves lowering their spears and listening to words that promised an end to the endless cycle of violence. The Ethereals did not negotiate a truce or broker a compromise between the warring parties. Instead, they presented a fundamentally different framework for understanding Tau society. The plains warriors possessed speed, mobility, and the aggressive spirit necessary for expansion and defense. The mountain and settlement dwellers had developed skills in construction, fortification, and the creation of increasingly complex tools. Rather than viewing these as competing interests, the Ethereals proposed that they represented complementary aspects of a single civilization. The warriors needed fortified positions to defend and weapons to carry. The builders needed protection while they worked, and warriors to secure resources. Both needed the philosophy of the greater good to unite their efforts toward collective advancement rather than mutual destruction. Within days, the siege ended. The plains warriors and the defenders of Phaeton met outside the walls not as enemies, but as different components of an emerging unified society. The speed of this transformation cannot be overstated. Individuals who had lost family members to the other side, who had spent years trying to kill one another, suddenly embraced the philosophy of cooperation with what outside observers might consider suspicious enthusiasm. The Ethereals had accomplished in days what centuries of warfare had failed to achieve: the genuine unification of disparate Tau populations under a common purpose. The establishment of the caste system followed directly from these early unification efforts. The Ethereals recognized that the different Tau populations had developed specialized skills based on their environments and lifestyles, and they formalized these specializations into a rigid social structure. The Ethereals themselves became the on-caste, the guides and philosophers who would provide direction for Tau civilization. Their role was not to rule through force, but to coordinate and inspire, ensuring that all castes worked in harmony toward the greater good. The warriors, primarily drawn from the Plains tribes, but also including mountain defenders and forest hunters, became the Shah's caste, the Fire Warriors. These Tau would dedicate themselves to martial excellence and the defense of the growing empire. The Shah's caste absorbed the aggressive energy that had fueled the Montau and redirected it outward, toward external threats rather than internal conflicts. They developed increasingly sophisticated weapons and tactics, but always under the guidance of the Ethereals, who ensured that military power served the collective rather than individual ambition. The builders and craftsmen who had defended Phaeton and similar settlements became the Pheo caste, the Earth caste. These Tau possessed an intuitive understanding of how things worked and how they could be improved. The Pheo caste took responsibility for all aspects of construction, manufacturing, and technological development. They built the cities, forged the weapons, and eventually designed the spacecraft that would carry the Tau to the stars. The Earth caste represented the practical foundation upon which the entire civilization rested. The water-dwelling tribes, with their experience in trade and communication between different groups, became the poor caste, the water caste. These Tau specialized in diplomacy, commerce, and the dissemination of information. The water caste learned to navigate the complex social dynamics between different populations, whether Tau or alien. They became the voice of the empire, the negotiators who would attempt to bring other species into the greater good through persuasion rather than conquest. The air caste, the core, emerged somewhat later as Tau civilization developed flight technology. These Tau adapted to life in the skies and eventually in space itself, their bodies becoming lighter and more suited to low-gravity environments. The air caste took responsibility for all aspects of transportation and void warfare, connecting the growing empire and ensuring that no Tau world stood isolated from the collective. Each caste occupied a specific role in society, and movement between castes became forbidden. A Tau born into the fire caste would live and die as a warrior. An Earth caste member would never take up arms except in the most desperate circumstances. This rigidity, which might appear oppressive to outside observers, was presented as a fundamental aspect of the greater good. Each Tau served according to their nature and training, maximizing efficiency and minimizing conflict over roles and responsibilities. The philosophical foundations of the Tava went far beyond simple cooperation. The greater good demanded the complete subordination of individual ambition to collective progress. A fire warrior did not fight for personal glory, but for the advancement of the empire. An Earth caste engineer did not create to satisfy artistic impulses, but to serve the needs of all Tau. Personal desires, individual dreams, and selfish motivations were characterized as primitive remnants of the Montau, the kind of thinking that had nearly destroyed the species. The Ethereals taught that true fulfillment came not from personal achievement, but from contributing to something greater than oneself. This philosophy extended beyond the Tau themselves. The greater good proposed that all sentient beings in the galaxy should work toward collective betterment. The Tau viewed their mission as fundamentally benevolent. They sought to bring other species into a unified civilization where warfare and competition would be replaced by cooperation and mutual advancement. Species that joined the Tau Empire voluntarily would be incorporated into the existing caste structure, or allowed to maintain their own societies as long as they contributed to the collective good. Those who refused would be conquered, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, as their continued independence represented an obstacle to universal progress. The question of how the Ethereals achieved such complete and immediate control over Tau society has troubled Imperial scholars since first contact. The official Tao explanation, that the Ethereals simply presented a superior philosophy that rational beings naturally embraced, satisfies no one familiar with the realities of sentient psychology. Populations do not abandon generations of hatred and cultural identity within days because someone proposes a new social structure, no matter how logically appealing. The most prevalent theory involves pheromone control. The diamond-shaped organ on ethereal foreheads may produce chemical signals that affect Tao neurochemistry, creating feelings of calm, trust, and receptiveness to suggestion. This would explain the immediate cessation of hostilities when Ethereals appeared and the unquestioning loyalty that Tao display toward their ethereal guides. The pheromone theory has some support from Imperial biological studies of captured Tao, which have identified unusual receptor sites in Tao neural tissue that respond to airborne chemical signals. However, this theory struggles to explain why the effect appears permanent rather than temporary, and why Tao remain devoted to the greater good even when far from any ethereal presence. Genetic manipulation presents another possibility. Perhaps the Ethereals represent a deliberately engineered subspecies, created with specific traits designed to command authority over baseline Tao. This would require an external actor with sophisticated biological knowledge and the ability to insert these modified individuals into Tao society at precisely the right moment. The genetic manipulation theory gains credibility from the fact that the Ethereals appeared simultaneously across the homeworld, with no apparent prior population or breeding group, suggesting they were introduced rather than evolved naturally. The most disturbing theory, whispered among certain inquisitorial circles, involves external intervention by the Eldar. The timing of the ethereal appearance coincides suspiciously with the period when the Eldar were desperately seeking ways to counter chaos expansion following the fall. A young, psychically null species unified under a philosophy that emphasized collective good over individual desire might serve as a useful tool or buffer against the ruinous powers. Some theorists point to reports of Eldar activity in the region of space near the Tau homeworld during the relevant period, suggesting that Craftworld seers may have engineered the entire ethereal phenomenon as part of some incomprehensibly complex plan. Other possibilities exist. Perhaps the Ethereals represent a natural evolutionary development, a subspecies that emerged during the Montau and remained hidden until the moment was right to reveal themselves. Perhaps they are the result of warp exposure, despite the Tau's psychic nullness, changed by forces they do not understand. Perhaps they were created by some other Xenos race entirely, one that has since departed or been destroyed. The Tau themselves either do not know or will not say, and the Ethereals maintain an enigmatic silence on questions about their origins. What remains undeniable is the effectiveness of ethereal leadership. Under their guidance, the Tau transformed from warring primitives to a spacefaring civilization in an astonishingly brief period. The caste system, whatever its origins, proved remarkably efficient at organizing society and directing resources toward collective goals. The philosophy of the greater good, regardless of whether it was adopted freely or imposed through biological manipulation, created a unified culture capable of rapid expansion and technological advancement. The Tau Empire that would eventually draw the attention and concern of the Imperium of Man had its foundations in those early days after the Montau, when the Ethereals appeared and everything changed. The centuries following unification saw the Tau civilization undergo a transformation that would have been unthinkable during the Montau. The caste system had channeled the species' energies into productive specialization, and the Earth caste in particular threw themselves into understanding and improving the technology that had begun to emerge from the unified settlements. The primitive stone tools and hide shelters of the tribal era gave way to worked metals, sophisticated architecture, and increasingly complex mechanisms. The Tau approach to technological development differed fundamentally from the Imperium's reliance on ancient templates and dogmatic preservation of knowledge. Instead, the Earth caste pursued systematic experimentation and iterative improvement, each generation building upon the discoveries of the previous one. The development of pulse weaponry represented one of the Earthcast's most significant early achievements. The principle behind pulse technology involved the generation of high-energy plasma bursts contained within magnetic fields, then propelled at targets with devastating effect. The earliest pulse weapons were crude affairs, prone to overheating and requiring cumbersome power supplies that limited their battlefield utility. Earthcast engineers worked for decades refining the plasma generation chambers, improving the magnetic containment fields, and developing compact power sources that could sustain multiple shots without failure. The result was the pulse rifle, a weapon that combined range, accuracy, and stopping power far exceeding the primitive projectile weapons the Tau had used during their unification wars. The pulse carbine followed as a shorter-ranged variant designed for close-quarters combat, sacrificing some range for improved mobility and rate of fire. Fire warriors trained extensively with both weapons, developing doctrines that emphasized the pulse rifle's reach advantage while maintaining carbine-equipped units for urban environments and defensive positions. The Earthcast continued refining the technology, creating pulse pistols for officers and specialized variants for different tactical situations. The distinctive blue-white flash of pulse weapon discharge would become synonymous with Tau military operations, a signature as recognizable as the bark of Imperial bolters or the crack of Eldar shuriken catapults. Battlesuit technology emerged from the Earthcast's efforts to enhance individual warrior effectiveness. The concept originated from industrial exoskeletons designed to help construction workers manipulate heavy materials, but Firecast commanders immediately recognized the military applications. If a single warrior could be encased in an armored suit that amplified their strength and carried weapon systems too heavy for unaugmented infantry, that warrior could dominate the battlefield in ways impossible for conventional troops. The first battlesuits were clumsy, their reactive armor plating barely adequate, and their targeting systems primitive by later standards. Pilots struggled with the interface between their own movements and the suit's responses, leading to accidents and training injuries. The Earthcast persisted, studying how Tau neural systems could be more effectively linked to mechanical systems. They developed increasingly sophisticated neural interfaces that translated pilot intentions into suit movements with minimal delay. The armor plating evolved from simple reactive plates to advanced composites that could withstand sustained fire from multiple directions. Weapon mounts became modular, allowing commanders to configure suits for specific mission requirements. The XV-8 Crisis battlesuit, which would become the iconic symbol of Firecast mobile warfare, represented generations of incremental improvements and hard-won battlefield experience. The development of gravitic drive technology proved crucial to Tau expansion beyond their homeworld. Unlike the Imperium's reliance on plasma drives and reaction engines, the Earthcast pursued an understanding of gravitational manipulation. Their early experiments involved creating localized gravity fields that could be adjusted in strength and direction, effectively allowing vehicles to push against planetary gravity itself. The first gravitic vehicles were atmospheric craft, skimmers that used the drive technology to achieve remarkable speed and maneuverability while remaining close to the surface. These vehicles revolutionized Firecast tactics, providing mobile fire platforms that could reposition rapidly and exploit terrain in ways impossible for ground-bound forces. The Devilfish Troop Transport exemplified the practical application of gravitic technology. The vehicle could carry a full squad of fire warriors, protect them with armor plating, and deliver them precisely where commanders needed them while providing supporting fire with mounted weapons. The Hammerhead gunship took the same basic chassis and mounted devastating anti-armor weaponry, creating a tank destroyer that combined the mobility of a skimmer with firepower capable of threatening the heaviest enemy vehicles. The Earthcast designed modular weapon systems that allowed the same vehicle frame to be configured for different battlefield roles, maximizing production efficiency while maintaining tactical flexibility. The crucial breakthrough came when Earthcast scientists achieved near-light speed travel. This technology, developed entirely independently of the warp drives used by the Imperium and other spacefaring species, allowed Tau vessels to accelerate to substantial fractions of light speed through real space. The ships did not enter the warp at all, avoiding both the dangers and the opportunities that warp travel presented. This limitation meant Tau vessels traveled far slower than Imperial ships, making equivalent journeys through the Immaterium, but the Tau's psychic nullness made warp travel impossible for them regardless. The near-light speed drives represented the best solution available to a species that existed almost entirely outside the warp's influence. The first interplanetary missions targeted the other worlds of the Tau sept system itself. Automated probes mapped the neighboring planets, identifying those with conditions suitable for colonization or resource extraction. The Firecast established small garrisons on these worlds, defending the initial Earth-cast construction teams as they built the infrastructure necessary for permanent settlement. The Aircast, whose members adapted remarkably quickly to void operations, took responsibility for the growing fleet of transport and exploration vessels that connected these new colonies to the homeworld. Viorla became one of the first major colony worlds, a planet whose proximity to its star created surface temperatures significantly higher than the Tau homeworld. The Firecast warriors recruited from Viorla developed a reputation for aggression and direct assault tactics, earning the Sept its name of hot-blooded. The harsh environment bred warriors who favored decisive action over patient planning, and Viorla fire warriors became known for their preference for close-range pulse carbines and aggressive Montka strikes. The Sept's academies produced some of the Firecast's most decorated commanders, individuals who embodied the offensive spirit that would characterize one major branch of Tau military philosophy. Daleth, by contrast, became known as the Sept of Greater Unity, a world whose strategic location made it a natural hub for trade and communication. The Watercast established major diplomatic centers on Daleth, and the planet's culture emphasized cooperation and integration more strongly than any other Sept. Daleth would later become crucial to the Tau's efforts to incorporate other species into the Empire, as its institutions developed the most sophisticated approaches to cross-species diplomacy and cultural integration. Fire warriors from Daleth learned to coordinate with auxiliary forces more effectively than their counterparts from other septs, making Daleth forces particularly valuable in campaigns involving multiple species. Borkin emerged as the sept most closely associated with technological innovation. The Earth-cast facilities on Borkin pursued advanced research into weapons development and aerospace engineering, pushing the boundaries of Tau capabilities. Borkin manufactured pulse weapons, featured enhanced range and improved power efficiency, while Borkin engineers contributed significantly to the development of new battlesuit variants. The Sept's forces often field-tested experimental equipment, accepting higher risk in exchange for access to cutting-edge technology that gave them advantages over enemies expecting standard Tau capabilities. Sassia developed as a sept that emphasized discipline and traditional fire caste values. The training academies on Sassia produced warriors known for their adherence to doctrine and their ability to execute complex coordinated maneuvers with precision. Sassia commanders favored carefully planned operations that leveraged the full combined arms capabilities of fire caste forces, integrating infantry, battlesuits, and vehicle support into seamless tactical formations. The Sept's reputation for reliability made Sassia forces highly valued for critical operations where failure was unacceptable. As the Tau expanded beyond their home system, they encountered their first significant Xenos threat in the form of Orc raiders. The Orcs, ubiquitous throughout the galaxy and always eager for violence, inevitably discovered the expanding Tau colonies. The first encounters shocked the Fire Caste, who had never faced an enemy like the Orcs. These green-skinned brutes possessed strength far exceeding their size, a complete disregard for casualties, and technology that functioned despite appearing to violate basic engineering principles. Orc weapons were crude, inaccurate, and often as dangerous to their users as their targets, yet they produced devastating firepower when massed in sufficient numbers. The initial orc raids targeted outlying colonies with minimal defenses, overwhelming small fire-cast garrisons through sheer numbers and ferocity. The orcs cared nothing for the greater good or rational negotiation, concepts that meant nothing to their violence-obsessed culture. Water-caste diplomats who attempted to communicate with orc warbands were simply killed, their bodies looted for anything the orcs found interesting. The fire caste realized they faced an enemy that could only be dealt with through military force, an enemy that would never be incorporated into the empire, but must instead be destroyed or driven away. The campaigns against the orcs forced the fire caste to refine doctrines that had been developed primarily through training exercises and simulations. The orcs' aggressive close combat tactics and resilience to pulse weapon fire demanded new approaches. Fire warriors learned to maintain disciplined firing lines, concentrating their fire to bring down charging orcs before the greenskins could close to melee range. Battlesuit teams practiced rapid redeployment, using their mobility to avoid being pinned down by orc mobs, while delivering precision strikes against orc vehicles and leaders. The Earth caste developed specialized munitions, including weapons designed to create overlapping fields of fire and area denial systems that could slow orc advances. The Montka philosophy crystallized during these early campaigns. The term translated as killing blow, and it emphasized decisive offensive action at the enemy's weakest point. Montka doctrine called for rapid concentration of overwhelming force, striking before the enemy could respond effectively, and exploiting any breakthrough with immediate follow-up attacks. The philosophy suited operations against orcs particularly well, as the greenskins' lack of sophisticated command structures meant that destroying their leaders often caused entire warbands to collapse into infighting. Firecaste commanders practicing Montka would identify orc warbosses, concentrate battlesuit and vehicle firepower to eliminate them, then exploit the resulting confusion to shatter the entire orc force. The Koyan philosophy developed as a counterpoint to Montka aggression. Koyan meant patient hunter, and it drew on ancient Tao hunting traditions from before unification. The philosophy emphasized careful preparation, detailed intelligence gathering, and the creation of situations where the enemy would be drawn into predetermined killing zones. Koyan operations involved establishing strong defensive positions, then using mobile elements to lure enemies into engagement ranges where prepared fire warrior teams could destroy them with minimal risk. Against orcs, whose aggression made them predictable, Koyan tactics proved devastatingly effective. Firecaste commanders would sacrifice outlying positions to draw orc forces into carefully prepared ambushes, then annihilate the greenskins with coordinated fire from multiple directions. The interplay between Montka and Koyan became fundamental to Firecaste doctrine. Commanders learned to assess each situation and determine which philosophy better suited the circumstances. Some operations demanded the aggressive decisiveness of Montka, while others required the patience and preparation of Koyan. The most skilled commanders could transition between the two approaches within a single campaign, using Koyan to weaken an enemy force before delivering a Montka strike to finish them, or using Montka aggression to seize a position that could then be held through Koyan defensive tactics. The combined arms approach that would define Tao warfare emerged from these early campaigns. Fire warriors provided the backbone of any force, their pulse rifles delivering sustained, accurate fire at ranges where most enemies could not effectively respond. Battlesuit teams operated as mobile strike forces, using their speed and firepower to exploit opportunities and eliminate priority targets. Vehicles provided heavy firepower and transportation, allowing commanders to rapidly redeploy forces and concentrate strength where needed. Pathfinder teams, specialized fire warriors trained in reconnaissance and target designation, identified enemy positions and marked targets for precision strikes. Each element supported the others, creating tactical flexibility that allowed Tau forces to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The First Sphere expansion established patterns that would persist throughout Tau history. Each new sept developed its own character and specializations, while remaining committed to the greater good. The Firecaste refined doctrines through actual combat experience, learning from both victories and defeats. The Earthcaste continued advancing technology, each generation of equipment building on lessons learned from the previous generation. The aircast connected the growing empire, ensuring no colony stood isolated. The watercast worked to integrate newly encountered species, though the orcs proved utterly resistant to such efforts. The Ethereals guided everything, their presence ensuring that expansion served the collective rather than devolving into the kind of competition that had characterized the Montau. The Tau Empire's expansion into the Damocles Gulf region proceeded with characteristic methodical efficiency throughout the early decades of the 41st millennium. The Firecast secured new worlds, the Earthcast built the infrastructure necessary for colonization, and the Watercast worked to integrate the various alien species encountered during expansion. From the Tau perspective, they were bringing enlightenment and progress to a benighted region of space, offering membership in a civilization dedicated to collective advancement. The Ethereals guided this expansion with careful planning, ensuring that each new sept world could support itself and contribute to the greater good before resources were committed to further conquest. The Tau remained ignorant of the true nature of the galaxy they inhabited. Their expansion had proceeded through regions of space that were, by galactic standards, remarkably empty of major threats. The orc raiders they had encountered represented minor warbands, rather than the massive was that could threaten entire sectors. They had not yet faced the tyrannid swarms that devoured all biological matter in their path, nor the Necron dynasties awakening from their ancient sleep. Most critically, they had not encountered the Imperium of Man, the galaxy-spanning empire that viewed all Xenos as abominations to be purged in the name of the God Emperor. The Imperium's discovery of the Tau came through routine patrol operations by the Imperial Navy. Scout vessels operating in the Damocles Gulf region detected unusual energy signatures consistent with void-capable technology, but not matching any known Imperial, Orc, or Eldar patterns. Investigation revealed colonies of an unknown Xeno species, their settlements displaying clear signs of advanced technological capability and organized expansion. The scout ships withdrew without engaging, their commanders recognizing that they had discovered something significant enough to warrant immediate reporting to higher authority. The information traveled up the Imperial chain of command, eventually reaching the administratum officials responsible for the region. The reports described a Xeno's empire actively colonizing worlds in Imperial space, or at least space that the Imperium claimed, even if it had not yet established permanent presence there. The Xenos possessed advanced technology, organized military forces, and appeared to be expanding deliberately rather than migrating randomly like orc hordes. This combination of factors triggered alarm among Imperial authorities who understood that allowing a Xeno's empire to establish itself unopposed would create a long-term threat to Imperial interests in the region. The Adeptus Ministorum added religious urgency to the military concerns. The Ecclesiarchy viewed the very existence of an organized Xeno civilization as an affront to the Emperor's manifest destiny to rule the galaxy. These aliens were not simply beasts to be exterminated, but an actual rival power with their own culture, technology, and apparent ambitions. The priests declared that the Emperor's light must be brought to this region of darkness, and that the Xenos must be purged to make way for proper human colonization. The religious fervor combined with strategic calculation to produce a consensus. The Tau expansion must be stopped through military force. The Damocles Gulf Crusade received official authorization in 742 of the 41st millennium. The Administratum committed substantial resources to the operation, recognizing that an unknown Xeno species with advanced technology required a serious military response. Multiple Imperial Guard regiments received deployment orders, drawn from various worlds across the Segmentum Ultima. The Adeptus Mechanicus contributed tech priests and support personnel, along with the logistical infrastructure necessary to sustain a major military operation far from established Imperial supply lines. Most significantly, several Space Marine chapters answered the call to crusade, bringing the Emperor's finest warriors to bear against this newly discovered Xenos threat. The Ultramarines committed forces to the crusade, their presence lending prestige and tactical expertise to the operation. The sons of Robute Gilliman brought their characteristic discipline and adherence to the Codex Astartes, their commanders studying the limited intelligence available on Tau capabilities and developing preliminary tactical assessments. The Scythes of the Emperor, a chapter with a long history of Xenos fighting, deployed with particular enthusiasm for the opportunity to face a new alien threat. Other chapters contributed smaller forces, strike forces, and specialist units that would operate independently or in coordination with the larger Imperial force. The Imperial Guard regiments represented diverse worlds and military traditions. Some came from hive worlds where they had trained in urban warfare and the grinding attrition of industrial combat. Others hailed from feral worlds where they had learned to fight in harsh environments with minimal support. Armored regiments brought their Leman Russ battle tanks and Chimera transports, ready to provide the heavy firepower that would be necessary against fortified Xenos positions. Artillery regiments prepared their basilisks and other heavy guns, ready to reduce Xenos cities to rubble. The sheer scale of the Imperial commitment demonstrated that the Administratum took the Tau threat seriously, even if they did not yet fully understand what they were facing. The Crusades' initial operations targeted outlying Tau colonies, testing Imperial forces against the Xenos' military capabilities while gathering intelligence on Tau tactics and technology. These early engagements shocked Imperial commanders who had expected to face primitives with stolen technology or crude weapons. Instead, they encountered an enemy with sophisticated combined arms doctrine, advanced energy weapons, and tactical flexibility that rivaled Imperial capabilities. The Tau pulse weapons proved devastatingly effective against Imperial Guard infantry, the high-energy plasma bursts punching through flak armor with ease and inflicting casualties at ranges where lasguns struggled to respond effectively. The Firecast's mobility surprised Imperial forces accustomed to fighting enemies that either charged directly into combat like orcs or held static positions. Tau commanders used their gravitic vehicles to rapidly redeploy forces, refusing to be pinned down and constantly maneuvering to engage Imperial units from advantageous positions. Battlesuit teams struck at Imperial flanks and rear areas, their jump jets allowing them to appear suddenly, deliver devastating firepower, then withdraw before Imperial forces could respond effectively. The Koyan philosophy proved particularly effective against Imperial Guard regiments, whose commanders expected conventional defensive positions that could be assaulted with massed infantry and armor. The Space Marines fared better than their mortal counterparts, their power armor providing protection against pulse weapon fire, and their superior training allowing them to adapt more quickly to Tau tactics. Ultramarines' tactical squads learned to identify and prioritize battlesuit targets, concentrating bolter fire to bring down the armored suits before they could withdraw. Assault squads used their jump packs to close with Tau positions rapidly, exploiting the fire warriors' relative weakness in close combat. The Scythes of the Emperor deployed Devastator squads equipped with heavy weapons, their las cannons and missile launchers capable of destroying Tau vehicles and battlesuits at range. The Imperial advance pushed deeper into Tau space despite the Xenos' effective resistance. The sheer weight of Imperial numbers began to tell as the Crusade committed more resources to the campaign. Tau colonies fell to sustained Imperial assault, their Firecast garrisons eventually overwhelmed by waves of Imperial Guard infantry supported by Space Marine strike forces. The Adeptus Mechanicus studied captured Tau technology with great interest, their tech priests fascinated by the Xenos' approach to plasma weaponry and gravitic manipulation, even as they condemned it as heretical deviation from proper Imperial technology. Daleth Sept became a primary target for Imperial forces. The Sept's strategic importance as a hub for Tau expansion made it a natural objective, and Imperial commanders recognized that its capture would severely disrupt the Xenos supply lines and communications network. The assault on Daleth involved the largest concentration of Imperial forces yet committed to the Crusade. Multiple Imperial Guard regiments converged on the Sept world, supported by Space Marine companies and extensive Adeptus Mechanicus technical support. The Imperial Navy established orbital superiority, bombarding Tau positions from space while preventing reinforcements from reaching the defenders. The fire-cast defense of Daleth demonstrated the full sophistication of Tau military capability. The Sept's commanders implemented a defense in depth, establishing multiple defensive lines that forced Imperial forces to fight for every kilometer of advance. Pathfinder teams infiltrated behind Imperial lines, calling in precision strikes from Tau aircraft and artillery. Battlesuit teams conducted constant harassment operations, appearing suddenly to destroy Imperial armor before withdrawing to new positions. The Earthcast had fortified key positions with sophisticated defensive works, creating strongpoints that required sustained assault to reduce. The urban combat in Daleth's primary city proved particularly brutal. Imperial Guard infantry advanced through streets swept by pulse weapon fire from fire warriors positioned in buildings and fortified positions. Space Marines led assaults on key structures, their power armor allowing them to survive the initial Tau fire and close to effective bolter range. The fighting devolved into a grinding attritional struggle as both sides committed more forces to the battle. The Tau refused to abandon their positions, recognizing that Daleth's fall would represent a catastrophic blow to the Empire's expansion efforts. The siege dragged on for months, consuming resources and lives on both sides. Imperial commanders grew frustrated with the Tau's refusal to engage in decisive battle, their mobile tactics and prepared defenses preventing the kind of crushing victory that Imperial doctrine favored. The Tau, for their part, struggled with the sheer scale of Imperial forces arrayed against them. Every destroyed fire-cast unit represented a significant loss to the relatively small Tau military, while the Imperium seemed capable of replacing its casualties indefinitely. The Watercast's intelligence-gathering efforts finally provided the Tau leadership with a horrifying revelation. The forces attacking them represented only a tiny fraction of the Imperium's total military capability. The Tau had believed themselves to be a significant power, their technology and organization marking them as a rising force in the galaxy. The discovery of the Imperium's true scale shattered this assumption. The Imperium controlled not dozens or hundreds of worlds, but millions, spread across the entire galaxy. Its military forces numbered in the countless billions, with resources that dwarfed anything the Tau could hope to match. The Space Marines, whose companies had proven so difficult to defeat, represented only a fraction of 1,000 chapters scattered across Imperial space. The Imperial Guard regiments fighting in the Damocles Gulf were drawn from a military force so vast that its full strength defied comprehension. The Ethereals faced a strategic crisis. The Crusade threatened to overwhelm the Tau's defensive capabilities through sheer attrition. Even if the Firecast fought perfectly, executing flawless tactics and maximizing casualties inflicted on Imperial forces, the mathematics of the situation favored the Imperium. The humans could afford to lose millions of soldiers in exchange for thousands of fire warriors. They could replace destroyed tanks and aircraft faster than the Tau could destroy them. The Empire's expansion, which had seemed so promising, now appeared to have brought them into conflict with an enemy capable of crushing them through weight of numbers alone. The resolution came not through military victory, but through external circumstances. Reports reached Imperial commanders of a far more serious threat emerging in another region of space. Hive Fleet Behemoth, a Tyranid swarm fleet of unprecedented size, had entered Imperial space and was consuming worlds at an alarming rate. The Tyranids represented an existential threat to the Imperium in a way that the Tau, for all their technology, did not. The Xenos in the Damocles Gulf were expanding slowly and could potentially be contained or dealt with later. The Tyranids were devouring entire worlds, their numbers growing with each planet consumed, and they were advancing toward Ultramar itself. The Ultramarines received urgent recall orders, their chapter master recognizing that the defense of their homeworlds took precedence over prosecuting a crusade against a relatively minor Xenos empire. Other Space Marine chapters similarly withdrew their forces, redeploying to face the Tyranid threat. The Imperial Guard regiments, while not immediately recalled, found their supply lines and reinforcements redirected to the anti-Tyranid operations. The Damocles Gulf Crusade, which had seemed poised to crush the Tau Empire, suddenly lost its momentum as the Imperium's attention shifted to a more pressing threat. The Water Caste, recognizing the opportunity, initiated diplomatic contact with Imperial authorities. They proposed a ceasefire, arguing that both sides should focus on more serious threats rather than exhausting themselves fighting each other. The Water Caste diplomats were skilled negotiators, but they faced Imperial officials who viewed all Xenos as fundamentally untrustworthy and any agreement with aliens as temporary at best. Nevertheless, practical considerations prevailed. The Imperium needed its forces elsewhere, and continuing the crusade would require resources that were urgently needed against the Tyranids. The ceasefire established a buffer zone between Imperial and Tau space, a demilitarized region that neither side would colonize or fortify. The agreement was explicitly temporary, with Imperial authorities making clear that the cessation of hostilities did not represent recognition of the Tau Empire's legitimacy or any abandonment of the Imperium's ultimate intention to purge the Xenos. The Tau accepted these terms, recognizing that any breathing space was valuable given their desperate strategic situation. The Ethereals understood that the Empire had narrowly avoided destruction and that future expansion would need to account for the Imperium's overwhelming scale. The Damocles Gulf Crusade's end left both sides claiming victory while privately acknowledging the inconclusiveness of the result. Imperial authorities declared that they had successfully contained the Xenos threat and established clear boundaries that the aliens would not be permitted to cross. The Tau celebrated their successful defense of the Corseps and their survival against an enemy that had initially seemed unstoppable. Both sides learned valuable lessons about their opponent's capabilities, lessons that would shape future conflicts in the region. The cessation of hostilities with the Imperium provided the Tau Empire with a critical opportunity to consolidate their gains and reassess their strategic position. The Damocles Gulf Crusade had revealed uncomfortable truths about the galaxy's true nature and the Tau's relatively modest place within it. The Ethereals convened councils across the Corseps, analyzing the lessons learned from contact with the Imperium and developing strategies for future expansion. The Firecast compiled detailed after-action reports on Imperial tactics and capabilities, while the Earthcast studied captured Imperial equipment to understand the technological approaches of this vast human empire. The Watercast's intelligence-gathering efforts focused on mapping the broader galactic situation, attempting to understand the complex web of conflicts and powers that existed beyond Tau space. The strategic analysis produced several key conclusions that would shape the Second Sphere expansion. First, the Tau could not match the Imperium's numerical superiority through conventional population growth and military expansion alone. The human empire's billions of worlds and incomprehensible military forces meant that any direct confrontation would ultimately favor the Imperium through sheer attrition. Second, the Tau possessed significant technological advantages in specific areas, particularly in battlesuit technology, pulse weaponry, and gravitic propulsion systems. These advantages needed to be leveraged and expanded to offset numerical inferiority. Third, the galaxy contained numerous other species, many of which existed outside Imperial control and might be incorporated into the Tau Empire, providing both additional military forces and specialized capabilities that the Tau themselves lacked. The decision to actively pursue the incorporation of auxiliary species represented a fundamental shift in Tau's strategic thinking. During the First Sphere expansion, the Empire had encountered various alien species, but had generally either avoided them or conquered their worlds without seriously attempting integration. The Orcs had proven utterly incompatible with the greater good, their violence-obsessed culture offering no common ground for cooperation. Other species had been too primitive or too scattered to warrant serious attention. The Second Sphere expansion would take a different approach, actively seeking out species that could contribute unique capabilities to the Empire while being receptive to the philosophy of the greater good. The Kroot of Petch became the first major auxiliary species to join the Tau Empire in significant numbers. The Kroot were avian-derived carnivores whose evolutionary history had produced a remarkable adaptive capability. They could absorb genetic material from consumed prey, allowing their species to incorporate useful traits over successive generations. Kroot society was organized around kindreds, extended family groups led by shapers who guided their people's evolutionary development through careful selection of prey. The Kroot had achieved limited spaceflight capability and worked as mercenaries for various powers across the galaxy, trading their services as warriors in exchange for technology and resources they could not produce themselves. Water-caste diplomats made contact with several Kroot kindreds operating in regions near Tau space. The negotiations proceeded carefully, as the Kroot had long experience with other species and maintained a healthy skepticism toward grand promises. The Water-caste emphasized the practical benefits of joining the Tau Empire: steady employment for Kroot warriors, access to advanced technology, and the opportunity to fight alongside a disciplined military force, rather than serving whoever paid the highest price at any given moment. The Kroot shapers recognized that the Tau offered something more substantial than typical mercenary contracts, a long-term partnership that could benefit their kindreds for generations. The Kroot brought capabilities that complemented Tau forces effectively. Their natural agility and keen senses made them excellent scouts and infiltrators, able to operate in terrain that challenged fire warriors. Kroot warriors preferred close combat, wielding traditional rifles that incorporated both ranged capability and vicious blades for melee. Their willingness to engage enemies at close quarters filled a significant gap in Tau tactical doctrine, as fire warriors remained vulnerable when enemies close to hand-to-hand fighting range. The Kroot's ability to consume fallen enemies and gain knowledge from their genetic material provided an unusual intelligence-gathering capability, though this practice disturbed many Tau who found the concept of eating sentient beings deeply unsettling. The Kroot also brought their own auxiliary creatures, beasts that their shapers had guided toward specific purposes over many generations. Kroot hounds served as attack animals and trackers, their enhanced senses and pack hunting instincts making them valuable for reconnaissance and assault operations. Krootoks, massive beasts bred for strength, carried heavy weapons into battle, providing mobile fire support that could keep pace with advancing Kroot kindreds. The Great Narlock and Greater Narlock represented even larger creatures, dinosaur-like beasts that could serve as cavalry mounts or living battering rams. The integration of these creatures into Tau military operations added a biological dimension to forces that had previously relied entirely on technology. The Vespid stingwings of the world, the Tau designated as Vespid, represented a completely different type of auxiliary. These insected aliens possessed natural flight capability, their crystalline wings allowing them to maneuver through three-dimensional space with remarkable agility. Vespid society was organized around hives led by queens who commanded absolute loyalty from their workers and warriors. The species communicated through pheromones and electromagnetic pulses, making direct communication with other species nearly impossible without technological assistance. The Earth-caste developed communion helms, sophisticated translation devices that allowed Vespid strain leaders to communicate with Tau commanders and receive orders during combat operations. The helms translated Tau commands into the electromagnetic signals the Vespid understood, while also providing tactical data and battlefield awareness that individual Vespid lacked. Some Imperial observers later claimed that the communion helms served a more sinister purpose, controlling the Vespid through technological means rather than simply translating commands. The Tau denied these accusations, maintaining that the Vespid joined the Empire voluntarily and that the helms merely facilitated cooperation between species with fundamentally different communication methods. The Vespid warriors, designated as stingwings by the Tau, carried neutron blasters, compact weapons that fired devastating short-range bursts of neutron radiation. These weapons proved particularly effective against heavily armored targets, the neutron radiation penetrating armor that might resist pulse weapon fire. The Vespid's flight capability allowed them to attack from unexpected angles, diving on enemy positions from above or maneuvering through urban environments where ground-bound forces struggled. Their chitinous exoskeletons provided natural armor protection, though they remained vulnerable to sustained fire from dedicated anti-infantry weapons. The Nikasar represented perhaps the most unusual auxiliary species to join the Tau Empire. These bear-like aliens possessed significant psychic abilities, a rarity among species that cooperated with the psychically null Tau. The Nikasar were peaceful by nature, their culture emphasizing contemplation and the exploration of psychic phenomena. They had developed unique spacecraft called Daos, vessels that used psychic power to navigate and propel themselves through space. The Nikasar Daos moved more slowly than Tau vessels, but possessed unusual capabilities related to their psychic propulsion systems, including the ability to detect warp phenomena that Tau sensors could not perceive. The Nikasar's incorporation into the Empire occurred through water caste diplomacy that emphasized the protection the Tau could offer. The Nikasar lacked any martial tradition and possessed no significant military forces, making them vulnerable to the various predatory species that inhabited the galaxy. The Tau offered security in exchange for the Nikasar's service as scouts and auxiliary fleet elements. The Nikasar Daos operated on the fringes of Tau fleet operations, using their psychic senses to detect threats and anomalies that Tau technology might miss. The arrangement suited both species, with the Nikasar gaining protection while contributing capabilities the Tau could not replicate through technology alone. The Demiurge, squat aliens with significant technological expertise, maintained a more distant relationship with the Tau Empire. These beings operated as independent mining guilds, their brotherhood organizations controlling access to valuable mineral resources across multiple star systems. The Demiurge possessed advanced mining and metallurgical technology, their understanding of material science rivaling or exceeding Tau capabilities in specific areas. Rather than fully joining the Empire, the Demiurge established trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, providing the Tau with access to rare materials and specialized components in exchange for protection and trading rights. The philosophy of multi-species cooperation under Tau leadership became a defining characteristic of the Second Sphere expansion. The Ethereals presented this approach as the natural extension of the greater good, arguing that just as different Tau castes contributed their specialized abilities to the collective, different species could contribute their unique strengths to a multi-species empire. The Fire caste developed new tactical doctrines that integrated auxiliary forces, learning to coordinate close combat specialists with Fire Warrior fire support, or to use Vespid stingwings to attack targets that conventional forces could not easily reach. The Earth caste accelerated their technological development programs, building on the lessons learned from combat with the Imperium. The standard XV-8 Crisis battlesuit underwent continuous refinement, each new production run incorporating improvements identified through battlefield experience. The Earth caste developed specialized variants for different tactical roles, including the XV-8-2 Crisis Iridium battlesuit with enhanced armor protection for commanders who needed to survive in the most dangerous combat situations. The modular weapon systems became increasingly sophisticated, allowing pilots to configure their suits with combinations of weapons optimized for specific threats. The development of the XV-88 broadside battlesuit addressed the Fire caste's need for heavy fire support capable of engaging enemy armor and fortifications at extended range. The broadside-mounted twin-linked railguns, or heavy missile systems, weapons too large and powerful for the standard Crisis suit frame. The design sacrificed mobility for firepower and armor protection, creating a platform that excelled in defensive operations or sustained fire support roles. Broadside teams typically deployed in prepared positions where their limited mobility mattered less than their ability to destroy priority targets at extreme range. The Earth caste's drone technology evolved significantly during this period. The basic gun drone and marker drone designs that had supported Fire caste operations during the First Sphere expansion were refined and improved. The artificial intelligence systems controlling the drones became more sophisticated, allowing them to operate with greater autonomy and respond to battlefield conditions more effectively. Shield drones appeared, equipped with generators that projected protective energy fields to absorb incoming fire. The drone's small size and expendable nature made them ideal for dangerous missions, and Firecast commanders learned to use them as force multipliers that enhanced the effectiveness of their more valuable warriors and battle suits. The expansion of the Aircast's capabilities proceeded in parallel with ground force improvements. The Earthcast developed new aircraft designs that pushed the boundaries of gravitic propulsion technology. The AX-10 Tiger Shark fighter bomber provided the Aircast with a heavy strike platform capable of engaging both air and ground targets with devastating effect. The Tiger Shark's armament included heavy burst cannons, missile systems, and in some variants, scaled-down railguns that could threaten even super-heavy enemy vehicles. The aircraft's speed and maneuverability made it difficult for enemy fighters to intercept, while its armor protection allowed it to survive ground fire that would destroy lighter aircraft. The expansion established numerous new Sept worlds that would serve as staging grounds for future Tau operations. Taun became one of the most significant colonies of the Second Sphere, its location making it strategically valuable for controlling trade routes and supporting further expansion. The Sept developed a reputation for producing skilled Earth-cast engineers who specialized in void-capable construction, building the orbital facilities and spacecraft that connected the growing empire. Taun's academies trained the next generation of Aircast pilots and ship commanders, their proximity to major trade routes providing ample opportunities for practical experience. Elsier emerged as a Sept known for its focus on stealth and reconnaissance operations. The Firecast cadres from Elsier specialized in infiltration and precision strikes, their training emphasizing patience and careful intelligence gathering before committing to action. Pathfinder teams gained particular renown for their ability to operate deep behind enemy lines, gathering critical intelligence and marking targets for precision strikes. The Sept's culture emphasized the Koyan philosophy more strongly than most others, producing commanders who excelled at creating elaborate traps and ambushes that destroyed enemies with minimal Tau casualties. The Second Sphere expansion pushed Tau borders significantly beyond the territories controlled after the First Sphere, establishing colonies in regions that brought the Empire into contact with new threats and opportunities. The Firecast encountered chaos-corrupted human renegades for the first time, facing enemies whose behavior defied rational explanation. The demonic entities that sometimes accompanied these forces particularly disturbed the Tau, who lacked any cultural framework for understanding warp-based phenomena. The Firecast responded to these encounters with characteristic pragmatism, developing tactics focused on destroying chaos forces quickly and efficiently while avoiding prolonged exposure to their corrupting influence. The expansion also brought the Tau into renewed contact with Orc forces, though these encounters differed from the earlier conflicts. The Tau now possessed greater experience fighting greenskins and had refined their anti-Orc tactics considerably. Firecast commanders understood how to exploit Orc weaknesses, using mobility and range advantages to destroy Orc forces before they could close to their preferred melee range. The integration of crude auxiliaries provided the Tau with forces capable of matching Orcs in close combat when necessary, reducing the Fire Warriors' vulnerability to Orc assault tactics. The philosophy of the greater good continued to guide expansion efforts, with the Watercast working to persuade newly encountered species to join the Empire peacefully when possible. The success rate varied considerably depending on the species and circumstances. Some alien civilizations recognized the practical benefits of Tau membership and joined willingly, contributing their unique capabilities to the collective. Others resisted, either through incomprehension of what the Tau offered or through commitment to their own independence. The Firecast stood ready to conquer those who refused the greater good, though the Ethereals preferred peaceful incorporation when circumstances allowed it. The Second Sphere expansion transformed the Tau Empire from a regional power confined to a relatively small volume of space into a genuine interstellar empire with diverse populations and significant military capabilities. The lessons learned from the Damocles Gulf Crusade had been absorbed and applied, producing a more sophisticated and capable civilization. The incorporation of auxiliary species provided capabilities that pure Tau forces lacked, while the continued advancement of technology maintained the qualitative advantages that allowed the Tau to compete with numerically superior enemies. The Empire's borders now encompassed dozens of major, sept worlds and hundreds of colonies, each contributing to the collective strength of the greater good. The Third Sphere expansion began with unprecedented ambition and resources. The Ethereals had learned from previous expansion phases that consolidation and preparation produced better results than hasty conquest. The sept worlds established during the Second Sphere had matured into productive centers of industry and military recruitment, their populations fully integrated into the greater good and contributing their specialized capabilities to the collective effort. The Fire Caste had grown substantially, with new training academies producing warriors who had never known the uncertainty of the early expansion periods. These fire warriors entered service already familiar with the various enemies the Empire faced, their education including detailed tactical briefings on Imperial, Orc, and other hostile forces. The Earth Caste's manufacturing capacity had expanded dramatically, with orbital construction facilities and automated production complexes churning out battlesuits, vehicles, and weapons at rates that would have seemed impossible during the First Sphere. Commander Farsight emerged as the Fire Caste's most brilliant tactical mind during the initial campaigns of the Third Sphere. Born Oshawa on Viorla, he had distinguished himself through numerous engagements during the Second Sphere expansion, demonstrating an intuitive grasp of battlefield dynamics that exceeded even the most experienced commanders. His approach to warfare combined the aggressive Montka philosophy favored by Viorla warriors with a sophisticated understanding of enemy psychology and capabilities. Farsight possessed the rare ability to anticipate enemy actions and position his forces to exploit opportunities before they fully materialized. His crisis battlesuit teams became legendary for their precision strikes that decapitated enemy command structures, leaving hostile forces confused and vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The Arkanasha War tested Farsight's abilities against an Orc empire that had consolidated control over multiple star systems. The Greenskin warlord leading this empire had unified several major clans under his rule, creating an Orc force far more dangerous than the scattered warbands the Tau had previously encountered. The Orcs had fortified key worlds with crude but effective defenses, their mechs constructing massive fortress monasteries filled with weapons and swarming with greenskin warriors. Previous Tau attempts to dislodge the Orcs through conventional assault had failed, the Fire Caste forces suffering unacceptable casualties when they attempted to storm prepared Orc positions. Farsight received command of the campaign, with instructions to succeed where others had failed. He spent weeks studying intelligence reports and analyzing previous engagement records, identifying patterns in Orc behavior and weaknesses in their defensive arrangements. The Orcs excelled at close-range brawling, and their positions were designed to funnel attackers into killing zones where greenskin numbers and ferocity would overwhelm sophisticated tactics. Farsight recognized that attempting to fight the Orcs on their terms guaranteed failure. Instead, he developed a strategy that exploited the Orcs' aggressive nature and poor discipline. The campaign began with systematic raids against outlying Orc settlements and supply routes. Farsight's forces struck quickly, destroying Orc resources and killing any greenskins who responded, then withdrawing before the Orcs could organize effective counterattacks. The raids inflicted minimal casualties on Tau forces while steadily degrading Orc capabilities, and more importantly, enraging the Orc leadership. The Greenskin warboss, infuriated by the constant pinprick attacks and the damage to his reputation, ordered major offensives to crush the Tau raiders. Farsight had anticipated this response. His forces withdrew in apparent disarray, drawing the Orc armies away from their fortified positions and into terrain that Farsight had carefully prepared. The decisive engagement occurred in a valley system, where Farsight had positioned the bulk of his forces in concealed positions along the ridgelines and in fortified bunkers. The Orcs, convinced they were pursuing a beaten enemy, advanced into the valley with their typical lack of caution. Farsight waited until the entire Orc force had committed to the advance, then triggered a coordinated strike that caught the Greenskins in a devastating crossfire. Broadside battlesuits positioned on the high ground poured railgun fire into the Orc armor, destroying their crude tanks and trucks before they could maneuver. Crisis battlesuit teams dropped from overhead transports directly onto the Orc command elements, their plasma rifles and fusion blasters eliminating the warboss and his key lieutenants within minutes. Fire warrior teams unleashed disciplined volleys of pulse fire into the confused Orc mobs, cutting down Greenskins who attempted to charge up the slopes toward Tau positions. The Orc force disintegrated as their leadership structure collapsed. Without the warboss to maintain order, the various clans turned on each other in typical Orc fashion, each group attempting to establish dominance over the others. Farsight's forces methodically destroyed the scattered Orc remnants over the following weeks, reducing the Greenskin Empire to manageable warbands that could be contained or eliminated by garrison forces. The Arkanasha War established Farsight's reputation as the Tau Empire's greatest military commander, a warrior whose tactical genius allowed small Tau forces to defeat numerically superior enemies through superior planning and execution. The success at Arkanasha led to Farsight receiving command of an expedition into regions beyond the Damocles Gulf, territories that Water Caste intelligence suggested contained numerous worlds suitable for colonization. The Farsight expedition represented one of the Third Sphere's most ambitious undertakings, a major military force tasked with establishing Tau presence in regions far from the Corcepts. The expedition included substantial fire caste forces built around Farsight's veteran crisis battlesuit teams, supported by Earth caste construction units prepared to establish colonies on conquered worlds and water caste diplomats ready to negotiate with any species willing to join the greater good peacefully. The early stages of the expedition proceeded according to plan. Farsight's forces secured several worlds without significant resistance, establishing forward bases that would support further expansion. The Fire Caste encountered scattered Orc forces and minor human settlements, dealing with both efficiently through the tactics that had proven effective in previous campaigns. The Water Caste made contact with several minor alien species, some of whom agreed to join the Empire after negotiations emphasized the benefits of Tau protection and access to advanced technology. The expedition appeared to validate the Ethereals' confidence in Farsight's abilities and the viability of aggressive expansion into previously unexplored regions. The situation changed dramatically when the expedition encountered worlds tainted by chaos corruption. These planets bore signs of human habitation, but their populations had been twisted by exposure to warp energies, their cities transformed into nightmarish parodies of imperial architecture. The inhabitants were no longer recognizably human in many cases, their flesh warped into forms that defied natural biology. The fire warriors who conducted reconnaissance of these worlds reported structures that hurt to look at, geometry that seemed to shift when observed directly, and symbols that caused physical discomfort even when viewed through remote sensors. Farsight ordered the expedition to avoid these tainted worlds initially, recognizing that they represented something outside his experience and tactical understanding. The Ethereals accompanying the expedition provided minimal guidance, their own knowledge of chaos being limited by the Tau's general ignorance of warp-related phenomena. The decision to bypass the corrupted worlds proved impossible to maintain as the expedition advanced deeper into the region. The tainted planets were too numerous and too strategically positioned to simply avoid, and some contained resources or locations that the expedition needed to accomplish its objectives. The first major engagement with Chaos forces occurred when Farsight's warriors assaulted a world designated in Tau records as Silkel. The planet had been an imperial colony before its fall to Chaos, and its population had transformed into cultists dedicated to the ruinous powers. The Fire Warriors advanced into the planet's primary city, expecting conventional urban warfare against corrupted humans. Instead, they encountered enemies whose behavior violated every tactical principle Farsight had learned. The cultists charged directly into pulse fire with no regard for casualties, their bodies absorbing damage that should have killed them instantly. Some cultists wielded weapons that fired projectiles which seemed to track their targets impossibly, while others brandished blades that cut through battlesuit armor as if it were cloth. The situation deteriorated further when demon entities manifested on the battlefield. These creatures appeared without warning, reality tearing open to disgorge beings that existed in defiance of natural law. The demons possessed forms that shifted and changed, their appearances causing psychological distress to the fire warriors who observed them. Some demons moved with impossible speed, crossing distances in eye blinks and tearing apart fire warriors with claws that bypassed armor through means the Earthcast could not explain. Others hung in the air on wings that should not have provided lift, raining down corrupting energies that caused equipment malfunctions and inflicted wounds that refused to heal properly. Farsight's forces fought with characteristic discipline, despite facing an enemy that defied comprehension. The fire warriors maintained their firing lines and followed their training, concentrating fire on priority targets and supporting each other through coordinated tactics. The Crisis battlesuit teams adapted their standard approaches, learning through brutal experience that sustained firepower could destroy even demonic entities if applied with sufficient intensity. Farsight himself led from the front, his battlesuit's weapons cutting down cultists and demons alike, while his tactical acumen kept his forces from being overwhelmed by the chaotic nature of the engagement. The Tau eventually secured Silkel through sheer determination and firepower superiority, but the victory came at a cost far exceeding anything Farsight had experienced in previous campaigns. Firecast casualties reached levels not seen since the worst days of the Damocles Gulf Crusade, and many survivors exhibited psychological trauma from exposure to demonic entities. The Earthcast personnel who examined the corrupted technology and structures on the planet reported phenomena that violated basic physics, materials that should not exist, and energy readings that made no sense according to Tau's scientific understanding. The Watercast diplomats found their skills utterly useless against an enemy that could not be reasoned with or persuaded. The expedition continued despite the disturbing revelations about chaos, though Farsight began to question the wisdom of advancing into regions so heavily tainted by warp corruption. Each new world brought fresh horrors as the Fire Warriors encountered the full spectrum of chaos manifestations. Worlds dedicated to different chaos gods presented unique challenges. Planets corrupted by Khorne's influence spawned endless hordes of berserkers who felt no pain and fought with mindless aggression that made orcs seem disciplined by comparison. Nurgle-tainted worlds festered with diseases that affected even Tau biology, despite their species' natural resistance to most pathogens. Tzeentch's corruption manifested in reality warping phenomena that caused weapons to misfire and communications to fail at critical moments. Slaanesh's influence created enemies who moved with unnatural grace and wielded sonic weapons that bypassed physical armor to attack the nervous system directly. The discovery on Artha's Moloch occurred during what should have been a routine planetary assault. The world showed signs of ancient human habitation but appeared abandoned, its cities empty and its infrastructure decayed. Farsight's reconnaissance teams reported unusual energy readings emanating from a structure in the planet's equatorial region, a massive complex that predated the visible human settlements by what appeared to be thousands of years. The architectural style matched nothing in Tau records of human construction, and the materials used in the structure's construction resisted analysis by Earthcast sensors. Farsight led a personal investigation of the structure, his Crisis battlesuit team accompanying him into the depths of the ancient complex. The interior defied logical spatial arrangement, corridors leading to chambers that seemed too large to fit within the structure's external dimensions. The walls bore carvings depicting battles between entities that resembled demons and armored warriors, whose equipment suggested advanced technology. At the heart of the complex, in a chamber whose ceiling extended upward into darkness beyond the range of their lights, Farsight discovered a weapon. The blade hung suspended in some kind of stasis field, a sword of unusual design with a blade that glowed with a faint red light. The weapon's proportions suited a being roughly human-sized, though its construction suggested it had been crafted for someone significantly stronger than baseline humanity. Inscriptions covered the blade in a language Farsight did not recognize, characters that seemed to shift slightly when observed directly. The stasis field deactivated as Farsight approached, the sword dropping into his hands as if it had been waiting for him specifically. The moment Farsight grasped the Dawn blade, he experienced a flood of sensations and information that bypassed his normal cognitive processes. Images flashed through his mind: ancient battles, the rise and fall of civilizations, the corruption of noble warriors by forces they did not understand. He saw the warp's true nature, the roiling sea of psychic energy that existed parallel to real space and the predatory entities that inhabited it. He understood in that instant the horrifying reality that the Ethereals either did not know or had deliberately concealed from the Fire Caste. The galaxy was not simply a collection of competing civilizations that could be unified through superior philosophy and technology. Fundamental supernatural forces existed that could corrupt, destroy, or enslave any civilization regardless of its technological advancement or philosophical sophistication. The Dawn Blade also showed Farsight something else, something that disturbed him even more than the revelations about chaos. He saw the Ethereals' arrival on the Tau homeworld during the Montau, but the vision suggested their appearance had not been natural or spontaneous. External forces had been involved, though the details remained unclear even with the Blade's revelations. The implications troubled Farsight deeply. If the Ethereals themselves were the product of outside manipulation, what did that mean for the greater good? Was the entire Tau civilization built on a foundation of deception, their vaunted philosophy nothing more than a control mechanism imposed by forces pursuing their own inscrutable agenda? Farsight's behavior changed following the discovery of the Dawn Blade. He became more withdrawn, spending long periods in meditation rather than his usual active engagement with tactical planning and troop leadership. The sword itself proved to be an effective weapon, its blade cutting through armor and flesh with ease that exceeded even the best Tau close combat weapons. More significantly, Fire warriors who fought alongside Farsight noticed that he seemed to anticipate enemy actions with even greater accuracy than before, as if the blade provided some form of precognitive awareness. The weapon never dulled and required no maintenance, its edge remaining impossibly sharp regardless of how much combat it saw. The Ethereals accompanying the expedition grew concerned about Farsight's changed demeanor and his possession of the alien artifact. They ordered him to surrender the Dawn Blade for study by Earth caste scientists and Ethereal scholars. Farsight refused, the first time in his career that he had directly disobeyed an Ethereal command. The confrontation escalated as the Ethereals insisted, and Farsight maintained his refusal, citing the blade's importance to his continued effectiveness as a military commander. The other fire warriors present found themselves torn between their conditioning to obey Ethereals without question and their loyalty to Farsight, who had led them to victory in countless battles. The situation reached a breaking point when Farsight articulated his doubts about the Ethereals' origins and the true nature of the greater good. He presented his concerns to the assembled Fire Caste commanders, arguing that the Tau deserved to know the truth about the forces that threatened them and the circumstances of their civilization's founding. The Ethereals responded with accusations of corruption and madness, claiming that exposure to chaos taint had damaged Farsight's judgment. They ordered his immediate removal from command and his return to the Corseps for psychological evaluation and re-education. Farsight's response shocked the Tau military establishment. He announced his secession from the Tau Empire, declaring that he and any fire warriors who chose to follow him would establish an independent enclave dedicated to fighting chaos and discovering the truth about the Tau's origins. Approximately 8 full cadres of fire warriors, along with their supporting Earth caste personnel and equipment, joined Farsight's rebellion. These warriors, veterans of the expedition who had fought alongside Farsight through the horrors of the chaos-tainted worlds, chose loyalty to their commander over obedience to the Ethereals. The Farsight enclaves established themselves on several worlds at the far edge of the expedition's area of operations, territories too distant from the Corseps for the Ethereals to easily reclaim. Farsight's forces fortified these worlds and prepared for the inevitable Tau military response. The Ethereals faced a dilemma. Committing sufficient forces to crush Farsight's rebellion would require withdrawing substantial military assets from other regions, potentially leaving the Empire vulnerable to external threats. Moreover, the Fire-caste warriors ordered to attack Farsight's enclaves showed reluctance to fight fellow Tau, especially warriors led by the Empire's most celebrated commander. The Ethereals ultimately chose containment over direct military confrontation. They declared Farsight and his followers traitors to the greater good, but did not immediately launch a major offensive to destroy the enclaves. Instead, they established a cordon around Farsight's territories and disseminated propaganda portraying him as corrupted by chaos exposure and driven mad by alien artifacts. The official Tau historical records were adjusted to minimize Farsight's achievements and emphasize his betrayal, though Fire-caste warriors who had served under him maintained their own unofficial accounts of his brilliance and integrity. The Third Sphere expansion continued despite Farsight's secession, though the loss of such a capable commander and his veteran forces represented a significant blow to Fire-caste capabilities. The remaining expedition forces consolidated their gains and established permanent colonies on the worlds they had secured. The encounters with chaos had forced the Ethereals to acknowledge, at least internally, that the galaxy contained threats that could not be defeated through conventional military force or incorporated through diplomatic persuasion. The Fire-caste began developing new doctrines specifically for fighting chaos forces, emphasizing rapid, overwhelming force and strict protocols to minimize exposure to corrupting influences. The expansion brought the Tau into conflict with Necron forces for the first time, an encounter that proved almost as disturbing as the initial chaos contact. The Necrons emerged from tomb worlds that had lain dormant for millions of years, their reawakening triggered by Tau colonization efforts in systems the ancient machines considered their territory. The Fire Warriors found themselves facing enemies whose technology operated on principles completely alien to Tau understanding. Necron warriors reassembled after being destroyed, their living metal bodies reforming from scattered components. Necron weapons disintegrated matter at the molecular level, reducing Fire Warriors to clouds of constituent atoms. The Necron forces moved with mechanical precision, their tactics executed with inhuman coordination that exceeded even the most disciplined Tau formations. The conflicts with Necron tomb worlds forced the Tau to develop entirely new tactical approaches. Conventional Fire-caste doctrine emphasized destroying enemy forces through concentrated firepower, but the Necrons' ability to repair and resurrect made attrition-based strategies ineffective. Earth-caste scientists worked frantically to understand Necron technology and develop countermeasures, though their progress remained limited by the fundamental incompatibility between Tau's science and the reality warping principles underlying Necron engineering. Fire-caste commanders learned through painful experience that the most effective approach involved identifying and destroying Necron command units and critical infrastructure, disrupting the tomb world's resurrection protocols before they could restore their full forces. Tyranid splinter fleets began appearing in regions near Tau's space during the later stages of the Third Sphere expansion, heralding a threat that would grow to dwarf even the Necron and Chaos encounters. The initial contact occurred when a Tau colony world went silent, its communication ceasing abruptly and all attempts to re-establish contact failing. The Fire-caste response force that investigated found a world stripped of all biological matter, its cities empty shells, and its once fertile fields reduced to barren rock. The only evidence of what had occurred came from automated defense systems that had recorded the final hours before being overwhelmed. The recordings showed a swarm of creatures descending on the planet from orbit, countless organisms of varying sizes working in perfect coordination to consume everything biological. The smaller creatures, later identified as termagants and hormigants, swept through population centers in living waves that overwhelmed defenders through sheer numbers. Larger organisms provided fire support with biological weapons that fired projectiles capable of penetrating battlesuit armor. Massive creatures the size of buildings smashed through fortifications, while flying organisms filled the skies. The entire planet had been consumed in less than a week, its biomass absorbed into the Tyranid fleet, which then departed for its next target. The Tau response to the Tyranid threat involved mobilizing substantial military forces to intercept the splinter fleet before it could reach more populated worlds. The Firecast discovered that fighting Tyranids required different tactics than combating any previous enemy. The Tyranids felt no fear and could not be demoralized or broken through psychological pressure. They adapted rapidly to Tau tactics, each engagement providing the hive mind with information it used to develop countermeasures. Tyranid organisms that survived encounters with pulse weapons appeared in later battles with enhanced resistance to energy-based damage. Creatures began exhibiting behaviors specifically designed to counter battlesuit mobility and fire warrior firing lines. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum represented a catastrophe of such magnitude that even the psychically null Tau could not ignore its effects. The Great Rift tore across the galaxy in the closing years of the 41st millennium, a massive warp storm that split Imperial space and plunged countless worlds into darkness. The Tau Empire, positioned in the eastern fringe, found itself on the edge of this cosmic disaster. The Ethereals initially struggled to comprehend the reports flooding in from their most distant colonies. Entire star systems had disappeared from communication networks. Navigation became unreliable as the warp's expansion distorted real space in ways that affected even the Taus near light-speed drives. The carefully planned expansion routes and supply lines that connected the Empire suddenly became treacherous or impassable. The Fourth Sphere expansion had launched before the Rift's opening, representing the most ambitious colonization effort the Tau had yet attempted. The Ethereals had committed enormous resources to this expansion phase, determined to push Tau borders significantly beyond the territories secured during the Third Sphere. The expansion fleet included thousands of vessels carrying fire-cast warriors, earth-cast construction teams, water-cast diplomats, and air-cast crew members. The fleet also transported substantial numbers of auxiliary species, with Kroot kindreds, Vespid hives, and various other allied aliens contributing their forces to the expedition. The scale of the operation reflected the Empire's growing confidence and industrial capacity, the accumulated strength of decades of consolidation and technological advancement. The Fourth Sphere fleet utilized experimental slipstream drive technology that the Earthcast had developed to accelerate interstellar travel. The standard near-light speed drives that had served the Tau since their first expansion beyond their home system remained reliable but painfully slow compared to the warp travel capabilities of other spacefaring civilizations. The Imperium could cross the galaxy in weeks or months through the Immaterium, while Tau vessels required years or decades to cover equivalent distances through real space. This fundamental limitation restricted Tau expansion and made it difficult to respond quickly to threats or opportunities in distant regions. The Earthcast scientists had worked for years to develop an alternative approach that might allow faster transit without requiring the Tau to enter the warp directly. The slipstream technology represented a compromise between pure real space travel and full warp immersion. The drives created a bubble of altered spacetime around the vessel, allowing it to slip partially into a shallow layer of the warp while maintaining a connection to real space. The theory suggested this would permit significantly faster travel than conventional drives while avoiding the dangers of deep warp exposure. The Earthcast had conducted limited testing of the technology on automated probes and small crewed vessels, with results that appeared promising enough to justify deployment on the Fourth Sphere fleet. The Ethereals approved the technology's use despite some concerns from conservative Earthcast factions, who argued that more extensive testing was necessary. The Fourth Sphere fleet activated their slipstream drives and began their transit toward the designated expansion zone. The initial phase proceeded according to the Earthcast's projections, with the fleet making significantly better time than conventional drives would have allowed. The vessels maintained their formation and communications remained clear between ships. The aircast crews reported unusual sensor readings from the slipstream boundary, fluctuations in the barrier between their bubble of altered space and the deeper warp beyond, but nothing that seemed to threaten the fleet's integrity. The expedition appeared to validate the years of research and development that had gone into the slipstream technology. Then the cicatrix maledictum erupted across the galaxy. The Great Rift's formation sent shockwaves through the warp that propagated into real space and the transitional layers where the Fourth Sphere fleet traveled. The slipstream bubbles protecting the Tau vessels destabilized as the warp convulsed around them. The carefully maintained barriers between the fleet and the deeper immaterium collapsed, plunging the Tau ships directly into the warp itself. For a species with virtually no psychic presence and no experience with warp travel, the experience proved utterly catastrophic. The Tau crew members found themselves exposed to phenomena their minds had no framework to process. The warp existed outside normal causality and physical law, a realm where thought and emotion manifested as tangible forces. Demons pressed against the ship's gellar fields, entities of pure warp energy that sought to breach the vessel's hulls and consume the souls within. The Tau, despite their psychic nullness, could perceive these creatures as reality around them twisted and warped. The ship corridors seemed to stretch and contract, distances becoming meaningless as warp energies bled through the failing protective systems. Time itself became unreliable, with some crew members experiencing hours, while others lived through days or weeks in the same objective moments. The auxiliary species aboard the Fourth Sphere fleet suffered even more severely than their Tau companions. The Kroot, Vespid, and other aliens possessed varying degrees of psychic sensitivity, making them more vulnerable to warp exposure than the psychically null Tau. The demons targeted these aliens preferentially, recognizing them as easier prey than the Tau, whose souls barely registered in the immaterium. Kroot warriors found themselves assaulted by visions of their kindreds being devoured by entities that wore the faces of their ancestors. Vespid hives experienced collective psychic trauma as the communion helms that connected them to Tau commanders began transmitting demonic whispers instead of tactical data. Other auxiliary species simply went mad, their minds unable to withstand exposure to the warp's fundamental wrongness. The Fire Caste warriors responded to the crisis with characteristic discipline, despite their complete lack of preparation for this type of threat. They established defensive perimeters around critical ship systems and attempted to protect the Earth Caste engineers working frantically to restore the slipstream drives or find some other means of escaping the warp. Fire warriors found themselves fighting enemies that defied everything their training had taught them. Demons manifested inside supposedly secure compartments, bypassing physical barriers through means the Tau could not understand. Pulse weapons proved effective against demonic entities, the high-energy plasma bursts capable of disrupting the warp energy that sustained the creatures, but the demons kept coming in numbers that threatened to overwhelm even the most disciplined firing lines. The auxiliary forces aboard the fleet began to fracture under the sustained warp exposure. Some Kroot kindreds turned on their Tau allies, their shapers losing control as the warriors descended into feral savagery. Vespid hives attacked anything nearby, their usual coordination replaced by mindless aggression as their collective consciousness fragmented under demonic assault. Other auxiliary species simply collapsed, their members dying from psychic shock or succumbing to possession by warp entities. The Fire Warriors found themselves forced to fight not only against demons, but against their own auxiliary troops, putting down former allies who had become threats to the ship's survival. The experience fundamentally altered the Fourth Sphere survivors' attitudes toward non-Tau species. The Fire Warriors who had fought alongside Kroot and Vespid for years, who had learned to respect and rely on their auxiliary comrades, watched these same allies transform into enemies or liabilities during the warp transit. The visceral horror of fighting creatures wearing the faces of trusted companions, or being forced to kill auxiliary troops to prevent them from spreading demonic corruption, created psychological trauma that no amount of training or philosophical commitment to the greater good could fully address. The survivors emerged from the warp with a deep-seated xenophobia that directly contradicted the Tau Empire's official policy of multi-species cooperation. The Earth-cast engineers managed to partially restore the slipstream drives on some vessels, though the technology functioned erratically and unpredictably after the damage sustained during the rift's opening. The fleet began to fragment as individual ships or small groups found themselves expelled from the warp at different locations and times. The carefully organized expedition dissolved into scattered elements, emerging across a vast region of space with no way to coordinate or even confirm the survival of other fleet components. Some ships appeared in the Nemyar Atoll, a region of space far from their intended destination. Others materialized in the Chalnath Expanse, an area that had been beyond Tau reach before the catastrophic transit. A few vessels were never heard from again, their fates unknown but presumed destroyed during the warp passage. The survivors who emerged in the Nemyar Atoll found themselves in a region contested by multiple factions. Imperial forces maintained a presence in the area, their own operations disrupted by the Great Rift, but still capable of responding to the sudden appearance of a Tau fleet. Orc warbands controlled several systems, their numbers swollen by the chaos that followed the rift's opening. The Fourth Sphere survivors, traumatized by their warp experience and scattered across multiple systems, faced immediate threats from enemies who recognized their vulnerability. The Firecast commanders struggled to establish coordination between the dispersed fleet elements while simultaneously defending against attacks from forces that outnumbered and surrounded them. The xenophobic attitudes that had developed during the warp transit manifested in increasingly extreme policies toward auxiliary forces. Firecast commanders who had previously valued their Kroot and Vespid allies now viewed all non-Tau species with suspicion and hostility. Reports began filtering back to the corseps of Fourth Sphere forces massacring their own auxiliary troops, executing Kroot kindreds and Vespid hives that had served loyally for years. The official justifications cited concerns about chaos corruption and the unreliability of aliens under extreme stress, but the underlying motivation stemmed from the psychological trauma of the warp transit and the association of non-Tau species with the horrors experienced there. The most disturbing incidents involved the systematic purging of entire auxiliary populations from worlds the Fourth Sphere forces secured. Fire warriors would conquer a planet, establish control, then methodically eliminate any non-Tau intelligent species they encountered. The killings were not frenzied or emotional, but coldly calculated, carried out with the same disciplined efficiency the Fire Caste applied to all military operations. Water Caste diplomats who attempted to negotiate with local alien populations found themselves overruled or ignored by Fire Caste commanders, who simply ordered the aliens destroyed regardless of whether they posed any actual threat. The Ethereals in the corseps received fragmentary reports of these atrocities through the disrupted communication networks. The Great Rift had severed direct contact with the Fourth Sphere survivors, making it impossible to issue clear orders or guidance. The Ethereals faced a crisis that threatened the fundamental principles of the greater good. The Tau Empire's entire expansion strategy depended on incorporating auxiliary species and presenting the Empire as a multi-species civilization dedicated to collective advancement. The Fourth Sphere's xenophobic purges directly contradicted this philosophy and risked undermining decades of Water Caste diplomatic efforts. Yet the Ethereals also understood that the Fourth Sphere survivors had endured experiences beyond anything in Tau history, trauma that might justify temporary deviations from standard policy. The establishment of the Stardite Nexus became a critical priority for maintaining any connection between the corseps and the territories beyond the Great Rift. The Nexus represented a massive undertaking, a way station constructed at enormous cost in a region where the Rift's effects were somewhat less severe. The Earth Caste engineers designed the facility to serve as a transfer point for ships and communications, a location where vessels from either side of the Rift could potentially meet and exchange information or cargo. The construction required breakthrough advances in protective technology, as the station needed to withstand the warp turbulence that pervaded the region while remaining accessible to Tau ships using conventional or slipstream drives. The Stardive Nexus took years to construct and required the commitment of substantial military forces to defend the construction site from the various threats that operated in the unstable region. Orc raiders attacked repeatedly, drawn by the concentrated Tau presence and the opportunity for looting. Imperial forces launched several attempts to destroy the station, recognizing its strategic importance to Tau operations. The Firecast garrison defending the Nexus fought continuous actions against these threats, while the Earthcast worked to complete the facility's critical systems. The station's completion represented a major achievement in Tau engineering and determination, a permanent foothold in a region that the Great Rift had rendered almost impassable. The slipstream technology underwent extensive refinement following the Fourth Sphere disaster. Earthcast scientists analyzed the data recovered from surviving ships, studying the drive failures and the conditions that had led to the catastrophic warp immersion. The research revealed fundamental flaws in the original design, assumptions about warp stability that had proven dangerously incorrect. The refined slipstream modules incorporated multiple redundant safety systems designed to prevent the kind of barrier collapse that had doomed the Fourth Sphere fleet. The new drives included emergency protocols that would forcibly eject a ship back into real space if warp conditions exceeded safe parameters, even if this meant stranding the vessel far from its intended destination. The improved slipstream technology allowed limited transit across the Great Rift, though the journey remained dangerous and unpredictable. Ships equipped with the refined drives could sometimes successfully navigate the turbulent warp conditions, emerging on the far side with their crews intact and their systems functional. The success rate remained far below what the Ethereals considered acceptable for routine operations, but it provided at least some capability to move forces and supplies between the divided portions of the Empire. The Stardive Nexus served as the primary staging point for these dangerous transits, with ships gathering there to prepare for the crossing and to provide assistance to vessels emerging from the rift's far side. The integration of Fourth Sphere survivors into the broader Tau military structure created persistent tensions that the Ethereals struggled to manage. The veterans who had survived the warp transit possessed combat experience and psychological hardening that made them valuable assets, but their xenophobic attitudes conflicted with standard Tau doctrine and caused friction with forces from earlier expansion spheres. Fire warriors from the First, Second, and Third spheres had learned to fight alongside Kroot and Vespid, developing trust and tactical coordination with their auxiliary comrades. The Fourth Sphere veterans viewed these same auxiliaries with barely concealed hostility, their presence triggering traumatic memories of the warp transit and the betrayals they had experienced there. The Ethereals attempted to address the problem through re-education programs designed to restore the Fourth Sphere survivors' commitment to the greater good's multi-species philosophy. The programs achieved limited success at best. The trauma the veterans had experienced proved resistant to conventional psychological treatment or philosophical instruction. Many Fourth Sphere fire warriors went through the motions of accepting re-education while privately maintaining their xenophobic beliefs. Others openly rejected the Ethereals' teachings, arguing that their experiences in the warp had revealed fundamental truths about the unreliability of non-Tau species that the Corcept's sheltered populations could not understand. The practical solution involved segregating Fourth Sphere forces from units that included substantial auxiliary components. The veterans were formed into pure Tau formations that operated independently or alongside other Fourth Sphere units. These segregated forces proved highly effective in combat, their shared trauma creating bonds of loyalty and mutual understanding that exceeded even the normal Firecast cohesion. The Fourth Sphere veterans fought with a grim determination born from having faced the warp's horrors and survived, an intensity that made them particularly valuable for the most dangerous operations. Firecast commanders learned to deploy Fourth Sphere units in situations where their xenophobic attitudes would not create problems, keeping them away from auxiliary forces and using them for operations that required pure Tau capabilities. The territories beyond the Great Rift developed their own distinct character. As the Fourth Sphere, survivors established permanent settlements in the Nemyr Atoll and Chalnath Expanse regions. These colonies operated with greater autonomy than the Corseps, the communication difficulties imposed by the Rift forcing local commanders to make decisions without waiting for guidance from the Ethereals. The settlements reflected the Fourth Sphere veterans' attitudes, with minimal integration of auxiliary species and a harder edge to their interpretation of the greater good. The colony's fire-cast garrisons maintained constant vigilance against external threats while also watching for any signs of chaos corruption, the veterans' warp experience having taught them to recognize the subtle indicators of demonic influence that other Tau might miss. The fire-cast military hierarchy evolved from the earliest days of unification into a sophisticated command structure that balanced individual initiative with collective coordination. The foundation of this hierarchy rests with the Shasla, the fire warriors who form the backbone of every Tau military operation. These warriors complete their basic training at academies across the various septs, learning the fundamentals of pulse weapon operation, battlefield movement, and the philosophical principles that guide fire-cast service to the greater good. The training emphasizes discipline and precision over individual heroics, instilling in each Shasla the understanding that their effectiveness comes from coordinated action rather than personal glory. Fresh graduates receive assignment to fire warrior teams, typically consisting of 12 warriors organized into 3-4 warrior squads. These teams drill constantly, developing the synchronized firing patterns and mutual support instincts that make fire warrior infantry so effective despite their relative physical weakness compared to many enemies they face. The Shasui serve as team leaders, veterans who have survived multiple combat deployments and demonstrated both tactical competence and leadership ability. A Shasui commands a fire warrior team, making immediate tactical decisions during engagements while maintaining communication with higher command elements. The position requires balancing adherence to overall strategy with adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. A skilled Shasui recognizes when to hold position and when to reposition, when to concentrate fire on priority targets, and when to spread fire to suppress multiple threats. The promotion to Shasui typically comes after several years of service as a Shasla, though exceptional warriors may advance more quickly if their abilities warrant recognition. Shasui also serve as the primary interface between common fire warriors and the battlesuit-equipped elite, translating strategic directives into tactical actions that their teams can execute. The Shasver represent the veteran core of the fire caste, warriors who have survived decades of combat and accumulated experience across multiple campaigns against different enemy types. These veterans typically pilot crisis battlesuits, using the enhanced mobility and firepower these platforms provide to execute precision strikes and rapid response operations. A Shasver leads a crisis battlesuit team, usually consisting of 3 suits configured for complementary roles. The veterans' experience allows them to read battlefield situations with intuitive understanding, recognizing patterns and opportunities that less experienced warriors might miss. Shasver serve as mentors to younger battlesuit pilots, passing on the accumulated tactical wisdom that cannot be taught in academies but must be learned through actual combat. The position carries significant prestige within fire-caste culture, as veterans who achieve this rank have proven their worth through survival and success in the most dangerous situations the Empire faces. The Shassel rank marks the transition from tactical leadership to operational command. These commanders typically lead cadres, formations that combine multiple fire warrior teams, battlesuit units, and vehicle elements into cohesive forces capable of independent operations. A Shassel must understand not just small unit tactics, but the broader operational art of coordinating different force elements to achieve strategic objectives. They plan operations, allocate resources, and make decisions that affect hundreds of warriors and the success or failure of entire campaigns. The promotion to Shassel requires demonstration of strategic thinking ability beyond simple tactical competence. Promising Shasver attend command academies where they study historical battles, practice operational planning, and learn to integrate the various capabilities that modern Tau forces bring to combat. The position demands both martial skill and intellectual capacity, as Shassel must be able to fight alongside their warriors when necessary while also maintaining the broader perspective needed for effective command. The Shasso represent the Fire Caste's supreme commanders, warriors who have distinguished themselves through decades of service and multiple successful campaigns. These individuals command entire contingents, forces that may include dozens of cadres and thousands of warriors. A Shasso operates at the strategic level, coordinating with Ethereals to align military operations with broader imperial objectives while translating those objectives into achievable military goals. The position carries authority to requisition resources, commit forces to combat, and make decisions that affect the fate of entire worlds. Shasso typically pilot custom-configured crisis battle suits or command variants equipped with enhanced communication systems and defensive capabilities, though some prefer the firepower of heavier platforms like Riptide battle suits. The rank represents the pinnacle of Fire Caste achievement, and those who attain it have proven themselves through both combat prowess and strategic acumen. The Sept-specific command structures add complexity to this basic hierarchy, with each major sept developing its own traditions and specializations. Viorla produces commanders known for aggressive tactics and preference for Montka doctrine, their training emphasizing decisive offensive action and rapid exploitation of enemy weaknesses. The Shassa Viorla who lead Major Viorla contingents epitomize this approach, planning operations that concentrate overwhelming force at critical points and maintain relentless pressure on defeated enemies. Sassia commanders favor more methodical approaches, their operations characterized by careful preparation and precise execution of complex coordinated maneuvers. The Shassa Sassia gain reputation for reliability and adherence to doctrine, producing victories through superior planning and disciplined execution rather than inspired improvisation. Daleth commanders specialize in integrating auxiliary forces, their tactical planning accounting for the unique capabilities of Kroot, Vespid, and other allied species in ways that commanders from other septs might overlook. The battlesuit technology that gives the Fire Caste its tactical flexibility began with the XV-8 Crisis Suit, a platform that balances mobility, firepower, and survivability in a package that allows a single pilot to dominate significant portions of the battlefield. The Crisis Suit stands roughly twice the height of a fire warrior, its sleek armor plating protecting the pilot while housing the systems necessary for flight, targeting, and weapons operation. The suit's jump jets allow rapid repositioning, the pilot able to leap over obstacles or withdraw from threatened positions with ease. The modular weapon mounts accept various armaments, typically plasma rifles for anti-infantry work, fusion blasters for destroying vehicles and heavy targets, or missile pods for flexible engagement options. The Crisis Suit pilot interfaces with the machine through neural connections that translate thought into action with minimal delay, the experienced pilot moving their suit as naturally as their own body. Crisis teams operate as the Fire Caste's rapid response force, deploying via aerial insertion to strike at critical targets or reinforce threatened positions before withdrawing to safety. The XV-88 broadside battlesuit addresses the Fire Caste's need for heavy fire support, capable of engaging enemy armor and fortifications at extended range. The broadside sacrifices the Crisis Suit's mobility for dramatically increased firepower and armor protection, mounting twin-linked railguns or heavy missile systems that can destroy the most heavily armored targets. The railgun variant fires hypervelocity projectiles that punch through armor through sheer kinetic energy, the magnetic acceleration system propelling the solid shot at velocities that make conventional armor irrelevant. The high-yield missile variant launches salvos of guided munitions capable of saturating areas with explosives or engaging multiple targets simultaneously. Broadside teams typically deploy in prepared positions, where their limited mobility matters less than their ability to provide sustained fire support. The suit's targeting systems allow engagement of targets at ranges where return fire poses minimal threat, the broadside pilots methodically destroying enemy vehicles and strongpoints, while fire warrior infantry advances under their covering fire. The XV-104 Riptide represents the Firecast's answer to super heavy enemy units, a massive battlesuit that dwarfs even the broadside in size and firepower. The Riptide stands 3 times the height of a fire warrior, its bulk requiring dedicated transport craft for deployment, and its weapon systems drawing power from a reactor that would serve a small facility. The suit mounts either a heavy burst cannon, capable of saturating areas with plasma fire, or an ion accelerator that fires devastating energy blasts able to destroy heavy tanks with single shots. The Riptide's shield generator projects protective fields that can absorb incoming fire, though sustained use of both shields and primary weapons risks overheating the reactor and forcing temporary shutdown. Riptide pilots undergo specialized training beyond standard battlesuit qualification, learning to manage the suit's power systems and exploit its capabilities while avoiding the catastrophic failures that occur when the reactor exceeds safe parameters. The Riptide deploys as a centerpiece for major operations, its presence providing both physical and psychological impact that shapes how enemies approach the battle. The XV-95 Ghostkill represents the Earthcast's efforts to create a stealth platform capable of operating independently in enemy-controlled territory. The suit incorporates advanced stealth field generators that bend light and electromagnetic radiation around its frame, rendering it nearly invisible to both visual observation and electronic sensors. The Ghostkill mounts fusion weapons for destroying priority targets and typically operates with accompanying stealth drones that enhance its concealment capabilities. Ghostkill pilots specialize in reconnaissance and assassination missions, infiltrating enemy positions to eliminate commanders or destroy critical infrastructure before withdrawing undetected. The suit's stealth systems require constant power and generate significant heat, limiting engagement duration and necessitating careful mission planning to ensure the pilot can reach extraction points before the stealth fields fail or enemy forces locate them through thermal signatures. The KV-128 Storm Surge pushes the boundaries of what can reasonably be called a battlesuit, mounting weapons and systems that approach the firepower of dedicated artillery platforms. The Storm Surge stands even taller than the Riptide, its frame designed around a massive pulse driver cannon or pulse blast cannon capable of destroying fortifications and super heavy vehicles. The suit includes secondary weapon systems, missile pods, and defensive systems that make it a complete weapons platform rather than simply a large battle suit. The Storm Surge deploys with stabilizer anchors that lock it into firing positions, sacrificing mobility for the stable platform necessary to manage the recoil from its primary weapons. The pilots operate the Storm Surge more like artillery crews than battlesuit operators, coordinating with forward observers and fire control systems to deliver precision strikes on targets beyond visual range. The combined arms doctrine that defines Tau warfare emerged from hard-won experience across multiple expansion spheres and conflicts with various enemies. Fire warrior infantry cadres provide the foundation, their pulse rifles delivering accurate fire at ranges where most enemies cannot effectively respond. A standard cadre consists of multiple fire warrior teams supported by gun drones that add additional firepower and can absorb hits intended for the more valuable warriors. The fire warriors advance in disciplined formations, their training emphasizing overlapping fields of fire and mutual support. When enemies close to dangerous ranges, the fire warriors execute fighting withdrawals, maintaining fire discipline while repositioning to maintain optimal engagement distances. The doctrine explicitly avoids close combat, recognizing that fire warriors lack the physical strength and melee training to compete with dedicated assault troops like Orc Boys or Space Marine assault squads. Pathfinder teams operate ahead of the main force, their role combining reconnaissance with target designation. Pathfinders carry lighter armor than standard fire warriors, trading protection for enhanced mobility and specialized equipment. The teams infiltrate enemy territory, gathering intelligence on force dispositions and identifying priority targets. Their marker lights illuminate targets for precision strikes, the coherent light beams providing guidance data that dramatically improves accuracy for both battlesuit weapons and vehicle-mounted systems. Pathfinder teams also deploy specialized drones, including pulse accelerator drones that enhance nearby pulse weapon range and grav inhibitor drones that slow enemy advances. The teams operate with significant autonomy, their leaders making tactical decisions based on immediate battlefield conditions rather than waiting for orders from higher command. Hammerhead gunships provide mobile anti-armor capability, their gravitic drives allowing rapid repositioning, while their main armament destroys enemy vehicles and fortifications. The standard Hammerhead mounts a railgun in a turret that provides 360-degree firing arc, the weapon's hypervelocity projectiles capable of penetrating the thickest armor. Alternative configurations replace the railgun with an ion cannon that fires charged particle blasts, trading some penetration for increased rate of fire and effectiveness against infantry concentrations. Hammerhead crews train extensively in shoot and scoot tactics, firing from one position then immediately relocating before enemy forces can respond with counter-battery fire. The gravitic drive speed allows the Hammerhead to keep pace with advancing infantry or withdraw from threatened positions faster than tracked vehicles can pursue. Devilfish transports move fire warrior teams across the battlefield, their armored hulls protecting the embarked infantry, while burst cannons and gun drones provide supporting fire. The Devilfish's gravitic drive allows it to navigate terrain that would stop wheeled or tracked vehicles, skimming over obstacles and water features without slowing. The standard deployment involves the Devilfish advancing under covering fire from hammerheads and battlesuits, approaching the objective before deploying its fire warrior cargo at optimal firing range. The transport then withdraws slightly, using its own weapons to support the dismounted infantry while remaining ready to extract the team if the situation deteriorates. Experienced Devilfish crews develop intuitive understanding of when to push forward aggressively and when to maintain standoff distance, their decisions often determining whether fire warrior teams can exploit opportunities or must withdraw from untenable positions. The drone support networks that permeate Tau forces represent a force multiplier that few other civilizations can match. Gun drones accompany fire warrior teams, their pulse carbines adding firepower while their expendable nature allows them to draw enemy fire away from living warriors. Marker drones assist Pathfinder teams, their sophisticated targeting systems improving the accuracy of marker light designation. Shield drones project protective fields that intercept incoming fire, their generators capable of absorbing shots that would otherwise kill fire warriors or damage battlesuits. The drones operate semi-autonomously, their artificial intelligence systems sophisticated enough to make tactical decisions within parameters set by their controllers. A fire warrior team leader can designate priority targets or defensive positions, then allow the accompanying drones to execute those directives while focusing on commanding the living warriors under their authority. The philosophy of integrated warfare that guides Tau military operations emphasizes the complementary nature of different force elements rather than relying on any single capability. Fire warriors provide sustained, accurate fire, but lack mobility and close combat capability. Battlesuits offer mobility and heavy firepower, but operate in small numbers and cannot hold ground. Vehicles deliver speed and protection, but require support to prevent enemy infantry from overwhelming them. The doctrine calls for these elements to support each other, each compensating for the other's weaknesses while exploiting their strengths. A typical engagement begins with Pathfinders marking priority targets, while hammerheads and broadsides destroy enemy armor from standoff range. Crisis teams strike at enemy command elements or heavy weapons positions, eliminating threats before they can engage the more vulnerable fire warriors. The infantry advances under this covering fire, their pulse rifles eliminating enemy infantry while drones absorb return fire. When enemies attempt to close to melee range, the fire warriors execute controlled withdrawals, while battlesuits and vehicles punish the advancing enemy with concentrated fire. The hunter-cadre organizational structure formalizes this combined arms approach, creating standing formations that train together and develop the coordination necessary for effective integrated operations. A hunter-cadre typically includes multiple fire warrior teams as its core, supported by at least one crisis battlesuit team and various vehicle elements. The exact composition varies based on mission requirements and available resources, with commanders adding pathfinders for reconnaissance-heavy operations or additional broadsides when facing armored threats. The cadre trains as a unit, conducting exercises that develop the timing and communication necessary for complex coordinated maneuvers. Fire warriors learn to recognize when battlesuit teams will strike and position themselves to exploit the confusion these attacks create. Battlesuit pilots develop understanding of how far fire warrior teams can advance and what support they need to maintain their positions. The integration of auxiliary species into hunter cadres follows doctrine that maintains fire caste supremacy in military command while exploiting the unique capabilities different species provide. Kroot kindreds attach to cadres as close combat specialists and scouts, their natural abilities complementing fire warrior ranged firepower. The Kroot operate under fire caste tactical command, but maintain their own internal leadership structure, with shapers directing their kindreds according to fire caste objectives. Vespid stingwings provide aerial assault capability, their flight allowing engagement of targets that ground-bound forces cannot easily reach. The Vespid strain leaders receive orders through their communion helms, translating fire caste directives into actions their warriors execute. Other auxiliary species contribute specialized capabilities, with each integration requiring careful planning to ensure their abilities enhance rather than complicate fire caste operations. The fire caste command structure maintains strict control over auxiliary forces, with fire caste officers retaining final authority over all military decisions regardless of auxiliary species input. This hierarchy reflects both practical considerations about maintaining unified command and deeper Tau beliefs about their civilization's superiority and destiny to guide other species toward the greater good. Auxiliary commanders may offer tactical advice based on their species' expertise, but fire caste officers make the final decisions about force employment and mission execution. The system generally functions effectively, particularly in cadres where fire caste and auxiliary forces have trained together extensively, though tensions occasionally emerge when auxiliary leaders disagree with fire caste tactical decisions or feel their forces are being misused or unnecessarily risked. The Earth caste's approach to technological development differs fundamentally from the Imperium's reverence for ancient standard template construct designs and the Adeptus Mechanicus's religious devotion to machine spirits. Where Imperial tech priests view innovation as potential heresy and preserve knowledge through ritualized repetition, Earth caste engineers embrace systematic experimentation and iterative improvement as the path to advancement. The caste's research facilities operate across every major sept world, their laboratories and testing grounds constantly developing refinements to existing technology while exploring entirely new applications of understood principles. This philosophical commitment to progress through cooperation rather than individual genius drives the Tau's remarkably rapid technological advancement, their civilization achieving in centuries what took humanity millennia during the dark age of technology. Plasma technology forms the foundation of Tau energy weapons, the Earth caste having mastered techniques for generating, containing, and projecting superheated matter with precision that exceeds most other civilizations' capabilities. The pulse rifle's plasma generation chamber creates ionized gas heated to temperatures that would vaporize conventional materials, the magnetic containment fields shaping this plasma into coherent bolts that maintain cohesion during flight. The Earth caste refined these systems through thousands of incremental improvements, each generation of pulse weapons incorporating lessons learned from battlefield performance and testing data. The power cells that feed pulse weapons represent similar evolutionary development, their energy density and discharge characteristics optimized through decades of materials research and engineering refinement. Earth-cast facilities manufacture pulse weapons by the millions, their production lines incorporating quality control measures that ensure each weapon meets exacting specifications while maintaining the output necessary to equip the Firecast's expanding forces. Ion weaponry emerged from Earth-cast efforts to create weapons capable of variable output, able to engage both infantry and armored targets with the same basic system. The ion cannon and its smaller variants accelerate charged particles to relativistic velocities, the resulting impact delivering both kinetic and thermal energy that can be adjusted based on target requirements. The weapon's overcharge capability allows concentration of additional power into single devastating shots, though this risks damaging the weapon's delicate acceleration chambers and requires cooling periods between uses. Earth-cast engineers designed the ion systems with modularity in mind, the same basic technology scaling from vehicle-mounted cannons down to the ion rifles carried by specialized fire warrior units. The development process involved extensive testing to balance power output against reliability, the final designs representing compromises between maximum destructive potential and the durability necessary for sustained combat operations. Railgun technology provides the Tau with their most powerful kinetic weapons, magnetic acceleration systems propelling solid projectiles at velocities that make conventional armor irrelevant. The Hammerhead's railgun can punch through the front armor of Imperial Lehman Russ battle tanks, the hypervelocity round continuing through the vehicle to exit the rear with barely diminished energy. The Earth-cast's railgun designs use superconducting magnetic coils that generate the intense fields necessary for acceleration, the entire system requiring sophisticated cooling mechanisms to prevent the coils from overheating during sustained fire. Broadside battlesuits mount twin-linked railguns that deliver even greater destructive potential, though the weapon's size and power requirements limit their deployment to the heaviest battlesuit frames. The Earth-cast continues refining railgun technology. Recent developments, including submunition rounds that fragment after firing to engage multiple targets, and experimental designs that push projectile velocities even higher through improved magnetic field configurations. Gravitic propulsion systems revolutionized Tau military mobility, the Earth-cast's mastery of gravitational manipulation, allowing their vehicles to ignore terrain that would stop conventional ground vehicles. The basic principle involves generating localized gravity fields that can be adjusted in strength and direction, effectively allowing a vehicle to push against planetary gravity or create artificial gravity wells that pull the vehicle in desired directions. The technology requires substantial power and sophisticated control systems, the gravitic drive continuously adjusting field strength and orientation to maintain stable flight while responding to pilot inputs. Devilfish and Hammerhead crews train extensively to exploit their vehicles' three-dimensional mobility, learning to use terrain masking and rapid altitude changes to avoid enemy fire while maintaining firing solutions on priority targets. The Earth-cast's gravitic technology extends beyond simple propulsion, with applications including the gravity wave projectors that some battlesuits use to slow enemy advances, and the specialized systems that allow the massive Manta dropships to operate in atmosphere despite their enormous mass. The philosophical approach underlying Earth-cast innovation emphasizes collaboration and information sharing rather than the hoarding of knowledge that characterizes many other civilizations. Earth-cast engineers working on pulse weapon improvements share their findings with colleagues developing battlesuit systems, recognizing that advances in one area often enable progress in others. The research facilities maintain comprehensive databases of experimental results, successful designs, and failed approaches. This accumulated knowledge available to any Earth-cast member whose work might benefit from it. The system occasionally produces redundant research as multiple teams independently explore similar concepts, but the Earthcast views this inefficiency as acceptable cost for maintaining the rapid iteration that drives their technological progress. The collaborative approach also means that breakthrough discoveries propagate quickly through Earthcast research networks, new techniques and materials appearing in production systems within months rather than the centuries or millennia such adoption might require in more conservative civilizations. The Watercast's diplomatic methodology combines sophisticated psychological understanding with practical incentives designed to make Tau membership appear attractive to species and civilizations encountered during expansion. Watercast diplomats undergo extensive training in xenopsychology, learning to recognize the motivations and cultural patterns that drive different species' decision-making. A Watercast envoy approaching a human world studies that planet's history, economic situation, and relationship with the broader Imperium before initiating contact. The initial approach emphasizes listening rather than immediate demands, the diplomats gathering information about local grievances and aspirations that might be exploited during negotiations. Imperial worlds suffering under heavy taxation or neglect from distant Terra represent prime targets, their populations potentially receptive to messages about the prosperity and fair treatment the Tau Empire offers. The preference for negotiation over conquest stems from both practical and philosophical considerations. Military conquest requires fire-cast resources that could otherwise support expansion into uncontested territories, and conquered populations often resist Tau rule for generations. Worlds that join voluntarily integrate more smoothly, their populations genuinely believing in the greater good rather than simply submitting to superior force. The Watercast's propaganda techniques exploit this preference, their messages emphasizing the benefits of Tau membership while downplaying or omitting mention of the rigid caste structure and ethereal control that will reshape the society of any world joining the Empire. The diplomats present carefully curated examples of successful integration, highlighting auxiliary species that have prospered under Tau guidance, while avoiding discussion of species that resisted and were destroyed or those whose cultures were systematically dismantled to fit Tau requirements. Trade establishment serves as the Watercast's primary tool for creating dependencies that facilitate eventual political integration. The diplomats offer access to Tau technology and manufactured goods, products whose quality and sophistication often exceed what the target civilization can produce domestically. A human frontier world might receive advanced medical equipment, agricultural technology that increases crop yields, or weapons superior to the aging Imperial Guard equipment their PDF forces carry. The initial trade occurs on generous terms, the Tau accepting payment in raw materials or local products, while providing finished goods at prices that undercut any competing suppliers. The target world's economy gradually reorients around Tau trade, local industries that cannot compete with imported Tau goods withering, while the population grows accustomed to the higher living standards that Tau products enable. When the Watercast eventually proposes formal incorporation into the Empire, the economic integration has already created powerful constituencies that support joining rather than risking the loss of Tau trade relationships. The seduction of imperial worlds represents the Watercast's most delicate and dangerous diplomatic work, as the Imperium responds to Tau diplomatic overtures with extreme prejudice when discovered. The diplomats must operate covertly, making contact with local leaders or dissident groups without alerting imperial authorities to Tau presence. The messages emphasize the Imperium's failures and the Tau alternative, contrasting the grinding oppression of imperial rule with the meritocratic efficiency the greater good supposedly offers. The diplomats highlight the Imperium's casual waste of human life, the arbitrary cruelty of its bureaucracy, and the technological stagnation that keeps imperial citizens living in conditions their ancestors would have considered primitive. The Tau alternative promises rational governance, technological advancement, and a society where individual merit determines status rather than birth or arbitrary imperial classifications. These promises contain enough truth to be compelling, while omitting the reality that Tau society's rigid caste structure and ethereal control simply replace imperial oppression with a different form of authoritarianism. The air caste evolution into void operations specialists occurred gradually as Tau civilization expanded beyond its homeworld. The caste's members, initially responsible for atmospheric flight operations and high-altitude activities, found their role expanding to include spacecraft operation as the Earth caste developed interstellar vessels. The transition proved remarkably smooth, the skills required for atmospheric flight translating effectively to void operations, despite the obvious environmental differences. Aircast pilots adapted to three-dimensional combat without the reference points that planetary surfaces provide, learning to navigate by instruments and coordinate with other vessels through communication systems rather than visual observation. The caste's culture evolved to embrace void operations as their primary purpose, atmospheric flight, becoming almost a secondary consideration as the Empire's expansion made space travel central to Tau military and economic activities. The Corvatra space fleet operates under Aircast command, its vessels ranging from small courier craft to massive battleships that can engage Imperial Navy cruisers on relatively even terms. The fleet's organization reflects Tau combined arms philosophy, with different vessel classes designed for specific roles that complement each other during operations. The Castellan-class escort provides point defense and anti-fighter capability, its burst cannons and missile systems protecting larger vessels from small craft and ordnance. The Orca-class gunship serves as a heavy fighter and bomber, capable of engaging both enemy spacecraft and ground targets with equal effectiveness. The Defender-class and Protector-class cruisers form the fleet's main combatants, mounting railguns and ion cannons that can damage or destroy enemy capital ships, while their gravitic drives provide maneuverability that larger Imperial vessels cannot match. Manta-class orbital dropships represent the Aircast solution to planetary assault requirements, massive craft capable of deploying entire hunter cadres directly from orbit to surface combat zones. The Manta-sized dwarfs conventional aircraft, its hull accommodating multiple fire warrior teams, battlesuit units, and vehicles in internal bays that open to disgorge their cargo once the craft reaches the deployment zone. The Manta mounts heavy weaponry including long-barreled burst cannons and missile systems that provide fire support during landing operations, the craft able to suppress enemy positions while its passengers deploy. The gravitic drives that propel the Manta generate power requirements that strain even Tau engineering capabilities, the vessel requiring substantial maintenance after each deployment to ensure its systems remain functional. Aircast crews that operate Mantas undergo specialized training in atmospheric entry and combat landing procedures, the skills necessary to safely deliver a Manta's cargo under fire-requiring abilities beyond standard pilot qualifications. Orca-class transports serve as the workhorses of Aircast logistics operations, smaller and more numerous than Mantas, but still capable of moving substantial forces and equipment. The Orca can operate in both atmosphere and void, its versatility making it invaluable for operations that require frequent transitions between space and planetary surface. A typical Orca carries a single fire warrior team or a crisis battlesuit unit, the craft's weapons providing covering fire during insertion and extraction. The design prioritizes reliability and ease of maintenance over maximum performance, Earth-cast engineers having learned through experience that logistics craft need durability more than cutting-edge capabilities. Orca crews develop intimate familiarity with their vessels, the Aircast's relatively small numbers meaning that pilots often operate the same craft for years or decades, rather than rotating between different vessels. The Aircast's genetic adaptation to zero-gravity environments represents one of the most visible examples of how Tau biology responds to sustained environmental pressure. Aircast members who spend their entire lives aboard spacecraft or orbital facilities develop physical characteristics distinct from other castes, their bones becoming lighter and more porous, as the lack of gravity eliminates the need for structures capable of supporting body weight against planetary pull. Their cardiovascular systems adapt to distribute blood without gravity's assistance, the changes improving efficiency in zero gravity while making extended planetary surface operations increasingly uncomfortable. The most extreme adaptations appear in air caste lineages that have operated in void conditions for multiple generations, these families producing individuals whose bodies are so specialized for zero gravity that they can barely function in standard gravity without mechanical assistance. The air caste views these adaptations with pride rather than concern, the physical changes marking their specialization and dedication to their role within the greater good. The rigid caste structure that defines Tau society produces specialized excellence through lifetime dedication to specific roles, each caste developing capabilities far exceeding what generalist populations might achieve. Fire caste warriors train from youth in combat skills and tactical thinking, their entire education focused on producing effective soldiers. Earth caste engineers study technical disciplines from childhood, accumulating knowledge and practical experience that makes them formidable problem solvers and designers. Water caste diplomats learn xenopsychology, negotiation techniques, and cultural analysis through comprehensive education programs that prepare them for interactions with countless different species and civilizations. The specialization allows each caste to achieve mastery in their domain, the focused development producing expertise that would be impossible if individuals needed to maintain competence across multiple disciplines. The system's inflexibility creates vulnerabilities that become apparent when situations demand capabilities outside a caste's traditional role. Fire warriors excel at ranged combat, but struggle when forced into close quarters fighting, their training and physical conditioning optimized for different combat styles. Earth caste engineers can design and build sophisticated technology, but lack the combat skills to defend themselves effectively when threatened. Water caste diplomats negotiate brilliantly, but find themselves helpless when negotiations fail and violence erupts. The prohibition against cross-training or role flexibility means that Tau forces sometimes lack capabilities that more flexible civilizations take for granted, gaps that enemies can exploit if they recognize and target them. A force composed entirely of fire warriors can be outmaneuvered by more mobile enemies or overwhelmed if those enemies close to melee range, despite the fire warrior's superior firepower. The prohibition of inter-caste breeding enforces genetic separation that prevents the castes from merging back into a single population over time. Tau law absolutely forbids romantic or sexual relationships between members of different castes, violations carrying severe social sanctions, and potential exile from Tau society. The rule maintains the genetic distinctions that have developed between castes, ensuring that fire caste members continue producing offspring with the physical characteristics suited to military service, while earth caste families pass on the traits that support technical work. The prohibition also serves social control functions, preventing the formation of family bonds that might create loyalties crossing caste boundaries and potentially challenging the Ethereals' authority. A fire warrior whose mate belongs to the earth caste might prioritize family considerations over military duty, a situation the caste system's architects designed the breeding prohibition to prevent. The Ethereals maintain social harmony through methods that combine inspirational leadership with subtle control mechanisms that most Tau never consciously recognize. An Ethereal's presence produces calm and receptiveness in other Tau, their words carrying weight beyond simple logical persuasion. Fire warriors who might question orders or hesitate in the face of danger find their doubts evaporating when an Ethereal speaks, replaced by certainty in the righteousness of their cause and confidence in ultimate victory. Earth caste engineers wrestling with seemingly impossible technical challenges experience renewed determination and creative insight after consultation with ethereal advisors. The mechanism underlying this influence remains unclear even to Earth-caste scientists who have attempted to study the phenomenon. The Ethereals' diamond-shaped forehead organ apparently producing effects that bypass conscious reasoning to directly affect emotional and cognitive states. The Ethereals' control extends beyond immediate presence through the philosophical framework of the greater good itself, the ideology providing justification for any action or sacrifice the Ethereals deem necessary. A fire warrior ordered to hold an untenable position against overwhelming enemy forces accepts the command without protest, understanding that their death serves the collective even if it accomplishes nothing for themselves personally. An Earth-caste engineer works to exhaustion developing weapon systems, the labor justified by how those weapons will protect the Empire regardless of the personal cost. The greater good becomes both explanation and excuse, a philosophical framework that rationalizes any demand the Ethereals make, while presenting resistance or questioning as selfishness that threatens the entire civilization. The system's elegance lies in how it makes Tau complicit in their own control, each individual internalizing the ideology and policing their own thoughts and actions without requiring constant ethereal supervision. The resurrection of Robute Guilliman and his assumption of the title Lord Commander of the Imperium fundamentally altered the strategic situation facing the Tau Empire. The Primarch's return energized Imperial forces across the galaxy, his legendary tactical acumen and administrative genius providing the Imperium with leadership it had lacked since the Horus Heresy. Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade, a massive military operation that deployed newly created Primaris Space Marines alongside conventional Imperial forces to reconquer worlds lost during the Great Rift's opening and to push back against all Xenos threats. The Crusade's fleets operated across multiple fronts simultaneously, their coordination and resource allocation reflecting Guilliman's superhuman strategic capabilities. For the Tau, this represented a nightmare scenario. An enemy they already could not match numerically had gained leadership, capable of exploiting the Imperium's vast resources with unprecedented efficiency. The Indomitus Crusade forces that advanced into the Damocles Gulf region came with explicit orders to eliminate the Tau threat permanently. Guilliman had reviewed reports of Tau expansion and technological capabilities, recognizing that allowing this Xenos empire to continue growing would create long-term strategic problems for the Imperium. The Crusade fleets included multiple chapters of Primaris Space Marines, their enhanced physiology and improved equipment making them even more formidable than the already dangerous Astartes the Tau had faced during previous conflicts. These new Space Marines stood taller than their predecessors, their reinforced organs and additional implants providing resilience that exceeded the already superhuman durability of standard Space Marines. Their weapons included plasma incinerators that fired more stable and powerful shots than older plasma weapons, and bolt rifles whose increased range threatened to negate some of the Tau's traditional engagement distance advantages. The defense of Tau Sept itself became necessary when Crusade forces penetrated deep enough into Tau space to threaten the homeworld. The Fire Caste mobilized every available warrior, pulling forces from garrison duties across the Empire to concentrate at the Sept that gave the entire species its name. The Ethereals understood that losing the homeworld would represent a catastrophic blow to Tau morale and legitimacy, potentially fracturing the Empire as other Septs questioned whether the greater good could survive such a defeat. The Fire Caste commanders developed defensive plans that leveraged every advantage the Tau possessed: superior mobility through gravitic vehicles, long-range firepower from pulse weapons and railguns, and the ability to coordinate complex operations through sophisticated communication networks. The Earth Caste fortified key positions around the primary cities, constructing defensive works that incorporated lessons learned from decades of warfare against Imperial forces. The Imperial assault began with orbital bombardment from Navy vessels that had fought their way past the Corvatra defense fleet. The bombardment targeted identified military installations and infrastructure, lance strikes, and macro cannon shells, destroying Earth-cast factories and fire-cast training facilities. The air-cast launched desperate counterattacks against the Imperial fleet, their vessels darting in to deliver railgun and ion cannon strikes before withdrawing ahead of the ponderous Imperial cruisers' return fire. The void combat favored neither side decisively, the Imperial Navy's superior numbers and armor offset by the Tau vessel's speed and maneuverability. The stalemate in orbit meant the ground campaign would determine Tau Sept's fate, the Firecast preparing to face Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine strike forces in battles that would decide whether the Tau homeworld remained free or fell under Imperial control. The Primaris Space Marines who deployed to Tau Sept's surface demonstrated tactical flexibility that exceeded what the Firecast had experienced fighting older Astartes generations. These warriors adapted quickly to Tau tactics, their enhanced cognitive processing allowing them to recognize Fire Warrior firing patterns and battlesuit deployment methods after only brief exposure. The intercessor squads that formed the core of Primaris infantry forces carried bolt rifles whose range approached that of pulse rifles, eliminating some of the engagement distance advantage that Fire Warriors relied upon. The Primaris aggressors, equipped with boltstorm gauntlets and grenade launchers, provided devastating close-range firepower that could suppress Fire Warrior positions and force them to withdraw or be overwhelmed. The Inceptor jump troops used their assault bolters to strike at Firecast rear areas, their sudden appearances disrupting carefully planned defensive positions and forcing the Firecast to commit reserves to deal with these deep penetrations. The Firecast response evolved as the battle progressed, commanders recognizing that tactics effective against standard Space Marines required adjustment when facing Primaris forces. Broadside teams concentrated their fire on individual Primaris squads, the sustained railgun bombardment necessary to ensure kills against these resilient enemies. Crisis battlesuit teams shifted their loadouts to emphasize fusion blasters over plasma rifles, the short-range tank killing weapons proving more effective at punching through Primaris power armor than the longer-ranged but less penetrating plasma weapons. Hammerhead crews learned to coordinate their strikes, multiple vehicles firing simultaneously at single targets to guarantee destruction rather than spreading fire across multiple enemies who might survive individual hits. The adjustment slowed but did not stop the Imperial advance, the Primaris Marines and their Imperial Guard support continuing to push toward the primary population centers despite mounting casualties. The turning point came when Firecast intelligence identified the Crusade Forces command structure and located the Imperial headquarters coordinating the assault. Commander Shadowsun, who had assumed overall command of Tau Sept's defense, personally led a strike force of veteran Crisis and Go-Skill teams in a precision raid against the Imperial Command Center. The operation required penetrating deep into Imperial-controlled territory, the stealth suit's concealment systems allowing the force to bypass Imperial patrols and defensive positions. The strike hit the headquarters during a command meeting, Shadowsun's fusion blasters killing several senior Imperial Guard officers, while her accompanying crisis teams destroyed communication equipment and data systems. The raid did not end the Imperial assault, but disrupted coordination sufficiently that Firecast forces could launch counterattacks against Imperial positions that had temporarily lost contact with higher command. The defense of Tau Sept ultimately succeeded through attrition and strategic calculation rather than decisive victory. The Crusade forces suffered casualties they could replace given the Imperium's vast resources, but Guilliman's strategic priorities required those resources elsewhere. The Primarch received reports of major chaos incursions in other regions, threats that demanded immediate attention and could not be delayed while Crusade forces ground down Tau resistance. The decision to withdraw from Tau Sept came from cold strategic logic. The Tau represented a long-term problem that could be addressed later, while the Chaos forces threatened immediate catastrophic damage to Imperial territories. The Crusade fleets disengaged and redeployed, leaving the Tau in control of their homeworld, but acutely aware of how close they had come to losing it. The Fifth Sphere expansion, launched in the wake of Tau Sep's successful defense, the Ethereals determined to demonstrate that the Empire remained capable of growth despite Imperial pressure. The expansion utilized refined slipstream technology that incorporated all lessons learned from the Fourth Sphere disaster. The improved drives, including multiple redundant safety systems and emergency protocols designed to prevent catastrophic warp immersion. The Earthcast engineers had also developed new navigation techniques that identified relatively stable routes through the warp's outer layers, paths where slipstream vessels could transit with acceptable risk levels. The Fifth Sphere fleets moved cautiously, their commanders authorized to abort transits and return to real space if conditions deteriorated beyond safe parameters. This conservative approach meant slower expansion than the Ethereals desired, but it avoided the catastrophic losses that had decimated the Fourth Sphere. The establishment of new colonies proceeded methodically, each world secured and fortified before the expansion pushed further. The Firecast learned from previous experience that rapid expansion created vulnerable supply lines and isolated colonies that enemies could attack without facing concentrated Tau forces. The Fifth Sphere commanders established strong defensive positions at key locations, creating fortified worlds that could serve as anchors for further expansion and rally points if Imperial or other forces launched major offensives. The Earthcast built orbital facilities and ground installations designed to support sustained military operations, their construction incorporating defensive features that would allow small garrisons to hold against larger attacking forces long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The Watercast worked to identify and recruit auxiliary species in the new territories, though the Fourth Sphere veterans' xenophobic attitudes created tensions when these auxiliaries joined Fifth Sphere forces. Hive Fleet Gorgon emerged as an existential threat that the Tau struggled to counter effectively. The Tyranid Splinter Fleet had learned from previous encounters with Tau forces, its organisms exhibiting adaptations specifically designed to counter Firecast tactics and technology. Gorgon creatures demonstrated resistance to pulse weapon fire that exceeded normal Tyranid durability, their carapaces incorporating biological materials that dispersed plasma energy more effectively than standard Tyranid armor. The hive mind directed Gorgon organisms to prioritize destroying Tau vehicles and battlesuits rather than engaging fire warriors directly, recognizing that eliminating the Tau's mobility and heavy firepower advantages would leave the relatively weak fire warriors vulnerable to being overwhelmed by Tyranid swarms. Gorgon forces also exhibited unusual tactical sophistication, their attacks coordinated in ways that suggested the hive mind had absorbed and analyzed extensive data on Tau military doctrine. The Firecast response to Gorgon required developing entirely new tactical approaches. Standard Firecast doctrine emphasized mobility and range advantages, forces repositioning constantly to maintain optimal engagement distances while avoiding enemy strengths. Gorgon forces countered this by using burrowing organisms to appear directly in Firecast rear areas, bypassing the careful defensive positions and forcing close-range engagements where Tyranid numbers overwhelmed Tau firepower. The Firecast began deploying seismic sensors and ground-penetrating radar to detect burrowing organisms before they emerged, allowing battlesuit teams to intercept and destroy them before they reached critical positions. Earthcast scientists developed specialized munitions, including airburst fragmentation rounds, that proved more effective against Tyranid swarms than standard pulse weapon fire, the shrapnel inflicting casualties across wider areas than precision plasma bolts could achieve. The Kelshan Sept bore the brunt of Gorgon's assault, its worlds positioned directly in the Hive fleet's path. The Firecast forces defending Kelshan fought with desperate determination, recognizing that if Gorgon consumed their Septs, worlds the biomass would fuel the fleet's growth and strengthen it for attacks against other Tau territories. The battles devolved into grinding attritional warfare as Tyranid organisms threw themselves at Tau defensive positions in endless waves, each wave learning from the previous one's failures and adapting tactics accordingly. Fire warriors expended ammunition at rates that strained supply lines, their pulse rifles overheating from sustained fire as they desperately tried to stem the Tyranid tide. Battlesuit teams ran their reactors beyond safe limits, accepting the risk of catastrophic failure in exchange for the firepower necessary to destroy the massive Tyranid creatures that led each assault. The Earth-cast facilities worked around the clock, manufacturing replacement equipment and ammunition, their production barely keeping pace with the consumption rates at the front lines. The Death Guard invasion of the Star-eyed Nexus represented a different type of threat, one that the Tau found even more disturbing than Tyranid consumption. The Chaos Space Marines of Nurgle's favored Legion brought with them diseases that affected even Tau biology, despite the species' natural resistance to most pathogens. Fire warriors who survived encounters with Death Guard forces often succumbed days later to infections that Earth-cast medical personnel could not treat effectively. The diseases spread through Tau positions, transforming the Star-eyed Nexus from a strategic way station into a plague-ridden nightmare where the living envied the dead. The Death Guard themselves proved nearly impossible to kill through conventional means, their bloated ceramite armor absorbing pulse fire that would destroy normal targets, while the Chaos Marines inside seemed to ignore wounds that should have been immediately fatal. The Fire Caste eventually contained the Death Guard invasion through extreme measures that violated normal Tau principles about preserving infrastructure and minimizing collateral damage. Commander Brightsword, who assumed command after the previous commander succumbed to Nurgle's rot, ordered the complete sterilization of infected sections of the Star-eyed Nexus. Earth-cast engineers rigged fusion reactors to overload, the resulting explosions vaporizing entire station sections, along with the Death Guard forces and infected Tau personnel they contained. The tactic succeeded in halting the plague's spread, but at enormous cost, the Star-eyed Nexus reduced to a fraction of its original size and capability. The incident reinforced the Fire Caste's understanding that Chaos represented a threat fundamentally different from conventional enemies, one that could not be defeated through superior tactics or technology, but required measures that approached the Imperium's own brutal pragmatism. The Orquas that periodically swept through Tau space continued to pose persistent threats despite the Fire Caste's extensive experience fighting greenskins. The Orcs' ability to reproduce and grow stronger through combat meant that even successful Fire Caste victories often created long-term problems, the spores released by dead Orcs eventually producing new generations of greenskins that required additional military operations to suppress. Some Tau worlds found themselves locked in endless cycles of Orc extermination campaigns, the Fire Caste clearing a planet of greenskins only to return years later, when new Orc populations emerged from spores the previous campaign had missed. The Earth Caste developed biological weapons designed to sterilize Orc spores, chemical agents that could be dispersed across contaminated areas to prevent new Orc growth, though the effectiveness of these weapons remained inconsistent, and their use raised ethical questions among some Tau who questioned whether such methods aligned with the greater good's principles. Necron Tomb World Awakenings presented perhaps the most incomprehensible threat the Tau faced. The ancient machines emerged from stasis with technology that operated on principles completely alien to Tau understanding, their weapons and capabilities defying the physical laws that Tau science considered fundamental. Gauss flares disintegrated fire warriors at the molecular level, reducing living beings to clouds of component atoms in seconds. Quantum shielding protected Necron vehicles from weapons that should have destroyed them, the defensive systems somehow causing incoming fire to phase through the vehicles without effect. Resurrection protocols restored destroyed Necron warriors, their bodies reforming from scattered components through processes that Earth Caste scientists could not explain or counter. The Fire Caste developed tactics focused on destroying Necron command units and power sources rather than attempting to eliminate individual warriors, recognizing that conventional attrition warfare proved ineffective against enemies who could resurrect indefinitely. The Farsight enclaves continued to operate independently beyond the Great Rift, their forces fighting chaos incursions and other threats without ethereal guidance. Reports filtering back to the Corseps suggested that the enclaves had not collapsed into chaos or reverted to the Mont despite lacking ethereal leadership, a fact that disturbed the Ethereals considerably. The enclave's fire warriors fought with the same discipline and coordination as their Empire counterparts, their adherence to the greater good apparently surviving without constant ethereal presence. Some Watercast observers noted that enclave forces seemed to fight with particular determination when facing chaos enemies, their veterans' experience with demonic threats during Farsight's original expedition providing knowledge that the Corseps forces lacked. The Ethereals officially maintained that Farsight and his followers remained traitors corrupted by chaos exposure, but privately some questioned whether the Enclave's continued success suggested uncomfortable truths about the necessity of ethereal control. The question of the Tau Empire's long-term viability in the 42nd millennium remains open, the answer depending on factors beyond the Tau's control. The Empire occupies a relatively small region of space compared to the Imperium's vast territories or the areas controlled by other major powers. The Tau population, while growing, remains tiny compared to humanity's countless billions or the endless orc hordes that infest the galaxy. The technological advantages that allowed the Tau to compete with larger enemies show signs of diminishing as other civilizations adapt to Tau tactics and develop countermeasures to Tau equipment. The Primaris Space Marines' improved range and durability reduced the effectiveness of Firecast doctrine, while Hive Fleet Gorgon's adaptations demonstrated that even the Tyranids could learn to counter Tau advantages given sufficient exposure. The greater good philosophy itself faces challenges that threaten its sustainability. The Fourth Sphere veteran xenophobia directly contradicts the multi-species cooperation that the Ethereals claim distinguishes the Tau Empire from other civilizations. The Farsight Enclave's survival without ethereal guidance raises questions about whether the Ethereals serve necessary functions or simply maintain control through biological manipulation and philosophical conditioning. The increasing exposure to chaos corruption forces the Tau to confront realities about the galaxy that their philosophy provides no framework for understanding, the existence of literal demons and warp-based powers challenging the rational materialism that underlies Tau's scientific and philosophical thought. The Ethereals themselves remain enigmatic, their true nature and origins still unknown despite millennia of Tau civilization. Whether they represent natural evolution, genetic engineering by external powers, or something else entirely, their control over Tau society appears absolute. No Tau has successfully resisted ethereal commands for extended periods except Farsight, whose possession of the Dawn Blade may provide some protection against ethereal influence. The possibility that the entire Tau civilization rests on foundations of manipulation and control rather than genuine philosophical enlightenment troubles those few Tau who dare consider it, though such thoughts rarely survive long when Ethereals are present to reinforce proper thinking. The Tau Empire in the era Indomitus stands at a crossroads, its future uncertain in a galaxy that grows more hostile with each passing year. The Great Rift's opening demonstrated that the universe contains forces beyond the Tau's ability to understand or control. The Indomitus Crusade proved that the Imperium remains capable of threatening Tau existence despite its internal problems and the countless other enemies it faces. The Tyranid Hive fleets continue their relentless advance, consuming all biological matter in their path regardless of species or civilization. The Necrons awaken from their ancient sleep, reclaiming territories they ruled millions of years before the Tau even existed as a species. Chaos corruption spreads wherever the warp's influence reaches, offering power and damnation to any who accept its bargains. Yet the Tau persist, their civilization adapting and surviving through technological innovation, tactical flexibility, and unwavering commitment to the greater good regardless of whether that philosophy represents genuine enlightenment or sophisticated control. The Firecast continues to refine their doctrine, learning from each engagement and developing new approaches to counter emerging threats. The Earthcast pushes the boundaries of Tau technology, their research producing weapons and equipment that maintain the qualitative advantages the Empire needs to survive. The Watercast works to expand the Empire through diplomacy and trade, bringing new species and territories into the greater good when military conquest proves too costly. The Aircast connects the scattered septs, ensuring that no colony stands alone against the darkness. The Ethereals guide everything, their presence ensuring unity of purpose and coordination of effort across the entire empire. Whether this guidance represents benevolent leadership toward a better future or manipulation in service of unknown agendas, matters less than the practical reality that it allows the Tau to function as a unified civilization in a galaxy where unity often determines survival. The Tau Empire remains small and vulnerable compared to the ancient powers that dominate the galaxy, but it endures through the same determination and adaptability that allowed the species to survive the Montau and build a civilization from the ashes of tribal warfare. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Tau fight for their vision of the greater good, whether that vision represents salvation or simply another form of the eternal conflict that defines the galaxy's existence.